An old man in a cassock recites a prayer for his soul. Danny opens his eyes and sees a glowing inscription suspended right in midair. Guardian of the Hive, Level 1. And outside the window lies a dead garden where not a single bee has been seen in 10 years. The darkness recedes in a rush. Danny lies on prickly straw beneath a low, soot-stained ceiling. His mouth tastes of iron and burnt copper. He sits up and nearly falls back down. His head splits as if someone had driven a nail between his eyes. An old man in a gray cassock looms over him. His eyes are cloudy. His lips move silently. A prayer. Danny blinks and lets his gaze cling to the rough stone walls. A narrow window without glass. The smell of incense and dry herbs. And something else, or rather, the absence of something. Sound. Danny has lived among bees for 28 years. He knows the hum of the hive as well as the beating of his own heart. And now, a garden is visible outside the window, and not a single bee can be heard from there. Not a single one. The silence rings in his ears. He sits up abruptly, and a golden panel flashes before his eyes. Hivekeeper, Level 1, activated. Danny pokes his finger at the letters, and his fingers pass right through them. The old man doesn't react, so he can't see it. Danny does what he always does when the ground falls out from under his feet. He counts. 1. I'm not in Oregon. 2. I'm not at my apiary. 3. A glowing inscription hangs before me. 4. I don't sense a single bee. 5. This old man is burying me alive. The old man finishes the prayer and utters a few words in a foreign language. Danny doesn't know them, but the meaning seeps right into his bones, into his brain. Stranger, you hear the silence. We've all been hearing it for 10 years now. Danny asks where he is. The old man answers. The monastery of Saint Apollo, the kingdom of Arion, the land once called the Kingdom of 1,000 Flowers. Danny latches onto the word, called. The old man looks away. The flowers still grow, but they no longer bear fruit. They bear no seeds. There is no one to pollinate them. And right then, a chill runs down Danny's spine. Not from fear, from understanding. He asks what happened to the bees. The old man sinks into a stool, his hands trembling. His voice is steady and hollow, like that of a man who has told this story 100 times. 10 years ago, the silent spring came. In a single spring, all the pollinators of the world vanished. Bees, bumblebees, butterflies, magical moths, every single one. No one knows the reason. Some cry out about a curse, others about the aftermath of the great magical war, still others about the wrath of a forgotten god. The result is the same. The world has ceased to bear fruit. The trees are green but stand empty. Alchemy is dying without honey. People gnaw on root vegetables and the meat from the black forest. The nobility sells land for a pot of old honey. 5 more years, maybe 6, and Arion will vanish. The old man falls silent, and something strange is happening in Danny's head. 28 years among the hives, a dissertation on the behavior of honeybees. 200 hives on a hillside in Oregon. 30 generations of human knowledge condensed into a single person, and this person has ended up in a world where the bees are dead. The panel flashes. Hive sense activated. 3-kilometer radius. Pollinators detected. 0. Danny reads the number and it hits him. Not despair. Anger. The quiet, stubborn anger of a beekeeper who arrived on a call and found a poisoned apiary. He knows that feeling. He's encountered it twice. when vandals destroyed his grandfather's 6 hives, and when pesticides from a neighboring farm wiped out an entire colony. Neither time did he shout, he just got to work. Danny looks at the old man and asks if there's a garden at the monastery. The old man nods. It's been abandoned for 10 years. Nothing much grows there anymore. Danny stands up. His legs are weak, but they hold him up. Lead the way. The old man looks at him as if he were mad, with pity and a touch of fear. But he stands up and leads the way. The monastery is tiny. Stone walls, a covered gallery, a courtyard with a dried-up well. Behind a low wall, a garden. It used to be beautiful here. Danny can tell that from the ruins. Stone paths, wrought iron arches for roses, a cracked fountain in the center. The roses have run wild and stretched into ugly vines, and yet they bloom into the void, because there's no one to pollinate them. Danny walks between the dead flower beds and listens, not with his ears. His hive sense works like radar. It probes every stone, every crack, every clod of earth. Nothing. 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 He reaches the fountain and drops to his knees. He places his palms on the cracked stone. He closes his eyes. Nothing. Nothing. And suddenly the radar twitches. Not a signal, not even a shadow of a signal. A whisper, as if someone tiny and weak is trying to breathe beneath the thickness of the stone. Danny freezes. He knows this feeling. That's how a womb feels in a sealed womb chamber the day before it breaks open, a barely living vibration. He opens his eyes and stares intently at the base of the fountain. There's a crack there, narrow, overgrown with moss. He calls to the old man. He needs a tool. They have to pry the slab loose. The old man doesn't move and asks why. Danny lets out a single word. Here. Something in his voice makes the old man turn and hurry away. 10 minutes later, 2 young monks arrive with crowbars and eye the stranger with suspicion. But the abbot nods and they get to work. The slab gives way on the 3rd try. It slides away with a crunch and a crash. Beneath it is a niche, the size of 2 palms, and in this niche, curled up into a tiny ball, she lies. The queen. The wild manna bee. Danny doesn't recognize her with his eyes. The sense of the hive identifies her instantly, and information floods his consciousness. Age about 11. Condition critical. Exhaustion, dehydration, on the brink of death, but alive. Alive. Danny reaches out, and his fingers don't tremble. 20 years of work have taught him one thing. Hands don't tremble near the queen. Never. He takes her in his palm. She is weightless. Her wings are crumpled and dull. Her body is shriveled. But he feels a pulse. Weak. Stubborn. The panel flashes. Cradle. Activated. Place the specimen in storage, he mentally confirms. The womb melts in his palms. A golden light flashes and fades. An icon lights up in the corner of the panel. Cradle. Specimens. 1. Status. Stabilization. He exhales and turns around. The abbot stands 3 paces away, staring at his empty palms. And his face changes, slowly, as if something frozen inside is beginning to thaw. His lips tremble. His eyes fill with tears. The old man falls to his knees right on the stone path and weeps. Silently. Tears run down his wrinkles and drip onto the stone. One monk flinches toward him, but the second holds him by the elbow. They watch as their abbot weeps for the first time in 10 years, since the quiet spring. And Danny stands in the middle of the dead garden, with empty palms and a glowing panel before his eyes. No weapons, no magic, no army. One half-dead queen in the magical vault, and 30 generations of knowledge about bees. He looks at the weeping old man, at the dead flower beds, at the flowers blooming into the void, and he says to himself quietly, "All right, time to get to work." The first night after the discovery, Danny didn't sleep. He sat on a mattress in his cell and studied the panel. It hung before his eyes, obedient to his mental commands. The moment he thought of the cradle, it unfolded into a detailed interface. Queen. Species. Wild manna bee. Subspecies unknown. Age. 11 years and 4 months. Condition. Critical. Stabilization. 12%. Estimated time to full recovery? 7 days. Danny read the data and ran through everything he knew in his head. 11 years. That meant the queen had been born a year before Silent Spring. She was the last of her generation, the only surviving individual within 3 kilometers, possibly in the entire world. He opened the selection tab. It was gray. Locked. At least 1 healthy queen and 6 worker bees are required to start a breeding program. He had 1 queen and 0 worker bees. He closed the panel and stared into the darkness. In the morning, the abbot came to see him. The old man's name was Father Benedict. He looked different than he had yesterday. His eyes were red from crying, but something new had appeared in them. Hope. A dangerous thing. Danny knew from experience. Hope made people do foolish things, but it also made them get up in the morning. Father Benedict sat down across from him and began to speak. He explained that the monastery of St. Apollo had once been one of the centers of beekeeping magic. Before the Silent Spring, 30 monks lived here, and each tended to the sacred hives. The hives stood in the garden, on the rooftops, and in special niches in the walls. The honey was used for rituals and medicines, and sold to the surrounding villages. Then the bees disappeared. The monks left one by one, some from hunger, some from despair. Now there were 6 left. Benedict himself, Sister Lillian, and 4 young novices who had nowhere else to go. Danny listened and nodded. Then he asked if he could look at the old hives. Benedict led him to the basement. There in the darkness stood 20 hives, massive wooden cylinders made from hollowed-out tree trunks. Danny crouched down next to the first one and ran his fingers over the wood. Oak. Old. Well-dried. Inside, remnants of wax and propolis. He opened the lid and peered inside. Empty. But the structure was interesting. Local beekeepers had carved ritual patterns inside the logs. Spirals and honeycombs and some kind of runes. Danny didn't understand the magical part, but he saw the main point. The construction was primitive. No frames, no dividing grid, no way to inspect the combs without destroying them. The bees built as they pleased, and the beekeeper couldn't control the process. A classic mistake. On Earth, they had abandoned such hives in the 19th century when Lorenzo Langstroth invented the frame hive. Danny stood up and dusted off his knees. He looked at Benedict. He said he needed boards, nails, a saw, a hammer, wax for treatment, and someone who knows how to work with their hands. Benedict asked why. Danny replied that he was going to build a hive. A real hive. Not a log. Benedict frowned. He said that the sacred logs had been used for centuries, that the very shape of the cylinder reflected the divine order, that changing the design meant insulting the memory of the ancestors. Danny listened to him patiently. Then he said that the sacred logs were ineffective. that it was impossible to control swarming in them, impossible to inspect the queen, impossible to deal diseases, that the ancestors were good people but poor engineers, and that if they wanted to bring the bees back, they would do it right. Benedict was silent for a long time. Then he asked where Danny knew all this from. Danny thought for a second. He replied that where he came from, people had been keeping bees for thousands of years, and that he was one of the best. Not modesty. Fact. 200 hives, a dissertation, 3 generations of family experience. Benedict looked him in the eye for a long time. Then he nodded. For the next 3 days, Danny worked like a man possessed. 2 novices helped him, young guys named Toma and Renard. Toma was tall and quiet. Renard was short and talkative. Both looked at Danny's with the expression of dogs who'd just been shown a disappearing ball trick. Danny drew with charcoal on the stone floor of the basement. A rectangular body, a removable bottom, 10 frames with foundation, a lid, a bottom board, an entrance with an adjustable slide. He explained each element. The frames are needed so the bees build their combs evenly and predictably. The removable bottom is for ventilation and cleaning. The entrance is adjustable to protect the small colony from the cold and predators. The distance between the frames is exactly 8 millimeters. Bee space. Any wider and the bees will build up the gap. Any narrower and they'll seal it with propolis. Toma asked where such precision came from. Danny replied that a man named Langstroth discovered it 170 years ago. Toma asked who Langstroth was. Danny said he was a priest. Toma fell into thought. Apparently, that explanation satisfied him. On the 4th day, the cradle sent a signal. The queen is 70% recovered. Her condition is stable. She is ready to awaken in 3 days. Danny felt his heart skip a beat. Then he pulled himself together. A queen without worker bees is a queen without an army. She can't gather nectar on her own. She can't build honeycombs on her own. She can't feed herself. She needs an entourage. At least a dozen worker bees to start with. And he didn't have any. He activated the hive sense again, expanded the radius to the maximum, 3 kilometers. He scanned every meter, every wall, every tree, every stone. Nothing. 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 He sat on the monastery roof and watched the sunset. The sun was setting behind hills covered in wild grass. Once, these hills had been fields of flowers. Now weeds grew there. Tough, tenacious, useless. The wind blew from the west, carrying the scent of earth and stone. Not a single floral scent. The panel flashed. A new notification. Skill level increased to 2. Hive sense. Radius increased to 5 kilometers. Danny closed his eyes and let the radar sweep out. 5 kilometers in every direction. He probed the earth and the air and the stone. And at the very edge, at the limit of sensitivity, in the northeast direction, something stirred. Faint. Multiple. Not a single individual. Several. Maybe a dozen. Maybe more. Far away, at the edge of the radius, somewhere beyond the hills. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He climbed down from the roof. He found Benedict in the chapel. He asked what lay 5 kilometers to the northeast. Benedict turned pale. He replied that the Black Forest began there, a place no one has gone for many years. Mutants roam there, creatures altered by magical hunger. Former herbivores turned predators. Former birds turned poisonous. Hunters went there for meat, and 1 in 3 returned. Danny nodded. He asked if he could find a guide. Benedict said it was suicide. Danny replied that at the edge of the forest he sensed living pollinators. For the first time since he'd awakened. Benedict fell silent. His hands trembled again. He asked how many. Danny replied he couldn't say for sure. Maybe 10, maybe 20. But they're alive. They're out there. And he'll go after them, with or without a guide. Benedict looked at him for a long time. Then he said he knew one person, a hunter. She comes to the monastery once a week to trade meat for salt. She knows the Black Forest better than anyone. But she's not easy. Danny asked what not easy meant. Benedict answered with one word. Dangerous. Danny shrugged. He said that bees are dangerous too. You just have to know how to handle them. The hunter arrived 2 days later. Danny heard her before he saw her. Or rather, he didn't hear her. He was standing in the courtyard, fitting the last frame into the hive body, when he suddenly felt a gaze on him. Heavy, appraising, like a cat deciding whether to pounce. He turned around. A girl was standing at the monastery gate, short, skinny, wearing a worn leather coat over a hunting jacket, a compound bow on her back, 2 knives on her belt. Her hair was black and short, roughly cut, most likely with a knife in front of a mirror. Her eyes were dark and unmoving. She looked at Danny as if she were calculating his worth in meat. Benedict came out of the chapel and introduced them. The hunter's name was G.A. Park. She was from the Northern clan, the last of her clan to be precise. G.A. didn't say hello. She looked at the hive, at the shavings on the ground, at the frames drying against the wall. She asked what it was. Danny replied that it was a hive, for bees. G.A. looked at him as if he were crazy. She said that bees didn't exist, that they had gone extinct 10 years ago, that she was a child when she heard the last buzz, and not once since then. Danny wiped his hands with a rag. He said he already had one queen, and that he sensed another at the edge of the Black Forest. Gia was silent for 3 seconds. Then she asked how much he was paying. Benedict coughed. He said the monastery had no money. Gia turned toward the exit. Danny said he wasn't paying with money, but if she took him into the forest and back alive, he would breed a strain of glowing bumblebees for her. Gia stopped. She didn't turn around. He asked why she needed glowing bumblebees. Danny replied that she was a hunter, that she went into the forest alone, that it was dark and dangerous in the forest at night, that glowing bumblebees could be living lanterns that flew around their owner and lit the path, that didn't need to be fed with oil, that aren't blown out by the wind, that also warn of danger because insects sense predators before humans do. Gia turned around. For the first time, something other than indifference flashed in her eyes. She asked if he could do that. Danny replied that not right away. He needed a source population of bumblebees and time for breeding. But yes, he could. Gia looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said they'd leave at dawn tomorrow, and that if he dragged his feet, she'd leave him behind. In the morning they set out. Danny put on the clothes the monks had given him, a coarse linen shirt, leather pants, boots 2 sizes too big. He looked ridiculous and knew it. Gia walked ahead, without turning around, without speaking. She moved like water, quietly and continuously. Not a single twig cracked under her feet. Danny followed her, sounding like a bear on a stroll. After an hour of brisk walking, they left the settled lands behind. The fields ended. Hills covered in wild grass began. The grass was tall, waist-high, tough, not a single flower. Danny walked and thought that on Earth, a field like this would be teeming with life. Grasshoppers, butterflies, bumblebees in the clover, beetles, bumblebees. Here there was only grass and wind, dead Earth. 2 hours later, the hills ended and the black forest loomed before them. The name was apt. The trees stood thick and dense. Their trunks were dark, almost black, from some kind of fungus or lichen. The canopies were so dense that the sun couldn't break through. Fog lay between the trunks, low and thick. It smelled of rot and something sweet, unpleasantly sweet. Jia stopped at the edge of the forest. She turned around for the first time in 2 hours. She stated the rules. Don't make a sound. Don't fall behind. Don't touch anything with your hands. If she says lie down, lie face down in the mud and hold your breath. If she runs, run after her without asking questions. Danny nodded. He activated the hive sense at full power. 5 kilometers. The signal was closer now, much closer. About 2 kilometers deep into the forest. And it became clearer. Not 10 individuals. More. Maybe 30, maybe 40. Pulsating. Alive. Some signals were strange, not like bees. A different rhythm, a different frequency. Bumblebees. Or something like bumblebees. They entered the forest. Darkness closed in overhead. Jia moved along paths known only to her. She skirted around fallen trees, stepped over roots. Twice she froze and raised her fist. Danny froze behind her. Both times something moved in the mist. Big. Heavy. Jia waited for it to pass and kept going. The third time, she didn't freeze. She fell. She simply collapsed to the ground as if cut down, dragging Danny with her. He lay face down in the wet leaves and heard footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Something passed 3 meters away from them. He couldn't see exactly what. Just a shadow. A huge one. With horns, or horn-like growths. The creature passed by. It didn't notice them, or wasn't interested. Jia waited a minute. She stood up. She brushed herself off. She didn't say anything. They kept going. 40 minutes later, Danny sensed that the signals were very close. 200 meters. 100. 50. He touched Jia on the shoulder. She flinched at his touch, but she stopped. He pointed the way. There. They made their way through thickets of ferns, huge ones, leaves as tall as a person, and they came out to a ravine. An oak tree grew at the bottom of the ravine. Old, incredibly old. Its trunk was 4 arms' widths around. The roots rose from the ground like walls, and there was a buzzing in the hollow of this oak. Faintly, barely audible, but it was buzzing. Danny froze. Jia froze beside him. She heard it too. Her face changed. The hunting mask cracked. Beneath it was the face of a 24-year-old girl who had last heard that sound when she was 14, when the world was still alive, when her clan still existed. Danny slowly descended into the ravine. He approached the hollow. He peered inside. There in the darkness, on the walls of the hollow, were honeycombs. Small, irregular, wild. And bumblebees were sitting on them, large, hairy, with dark gold stripes on their backs. 37 individuals. The system counted them automatically. Among them were 2 queens, the colony's condition: weakened, malnourished, but alive. Danny stood in front of the hollow and looked at the 37 bumblebees that had somehow miraculously survived 10 years in a dead world. They had hidden in the darkest corner of the Black Forest. They fed on the remains of fungal spores and lichen pollen. They survived. Stubborn, foolish, impossible. Just like that queen under the fountain. He carefully activated the cradle and began moving the individuals one by one. Every touch was gentle, every movement was precise. The bumblebees didn't sting. Maybe they sensed he wasn't an enemy. Maybe they were too weak. When the last bumblebee disappeared into the cradle, Danny sat down on the roots of a work. His hands finally began to tremble. 37 bumblebees. 2 queens, plus 1 manabee queen in the vault, 38 individuals. It was a pitifully small number, and it was all that stood between this world and final death. Ji-Ah stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. Her hands gripped the bow so tightly her knuckles turned white. She asked quietly, "Can you really bring them back?" Danny looked up at her. He replied that he didn't know, but he would try. The way back was harder. There were more creatures. Ji-Ah led him along detours. They ran twice. Once, Ji-Ah fired into the darkness, and something screeched and retreated. They reached the monastery at sunset. Dirty, exhausted, alive. Benedict was waiting at the gate. He saw Danny's face and understood everything without words. Danny raised his hand. He showed a number. 38. Benedict closed his eyes and whispered something like a prayer. Ji-Ah walked past them into the monastery. She stopped by the well. She drew some water. She drank. She turned to Danny. She said she was staying. She didn't ask. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stated it. Danny nodded. He went to his cell, sat down on the mattress, opened the panel. The hive. Specimens. 38. Species 1. Wild manabee. 1 queen. Species 2. Forest manna bumblebee. 37 specimens. 2 queens. Status: stabilized. He closed his eyes, leaned against the wall, and for the first time in a week in this world, he smiled. Danny hired the hunter Ji-Ah Pak for an expedition to the Black Forest, where he discovered a colony of 37 wild manna bumblebees with 2 queens in the hollow of an ancient oak tree. All specimens were placed in the cradle. Now Danny has 38 insects of 2 species. Ji-Ah decided to stay at the monastery. The manabee queen recovered on the 7th day. The panel beeped early in the morning while Danny was planing the 12th frame. The cradle, specimen number 1, wild manabee, queen. Status: fully recovered, ready for placement. Danny set down his plane, wiped his hands, went out into the garden. The Langstroth hive stood on a stone pedestal by the south wall. Beautiful, neat. 10 frames of foundation made from remelted old wax. The entrance faced south, the lid fit without gaps. Tom and Renard stood at a distance and watched. Benedict had come out too. And Ji-Ah. She sat on the garden wall and looked down from above. Everyone was silent. Danny walked up to the hive. He opened the lid. He took out the center frame. He activated the cradle and mentally selected the queen. A golden light flashed, and a bee appeared on the frame in his hands. He froze. He looked at her. The manna bee was larger than an earth honeybee, about 1.5 times as large. Its body was dark gold with an iridescent sheen. Its wings were slightly longer than usual, translucent with a faint silvery sheen, and it radiated warmth, physical, tangible, like a small coal. The queen walked across the frame, slowly, hesitantly. She had slept under the fountain's stone for 10 years. The world she knew had vanished. But the wax on the frame was from old monastery combs. It smelled like home. The queen paused. Her antennae twitched. She examined the cell, another one, a third, and began to descend into the comb. Danny carefully slid the frame back into place. He closed the lid. He turned around. Benedict was crying. Again. Thomas stood with his mouth open. Renard crossed himself. Gia showed no emotion, but Danny noticed that her fingers on the bow had relaxed, for the first time since he'd seen her. Now the real work began. The queen was in the hive, but she was alone. She needed worker bees. On Earth, Danny would simply have introduced workers from another family, but he didn't have another family of manabees. There were only bumblebees. And bumblebees wouldn't do. A different species, a different social structure, a different dance. He had studied bumblebees in the cradle. The data was interesting. Forest manna were larger than honeybees, hairy, with long proboscis, perfectly adapted to the cold and darkness. That's exactly why they survived in the Black Forest. But they lived in small colonies, not in colonies of thousands like honeybees. Their social model was simpler. A bumblebee queen and 20 to 30 workers. That's all. Danny decided to proceed in parallel. The man-bee queen would begin laying eggs. In 3 weeks, larvae would hatch from them. In 6 weeks, the first worker bees. Until then, the queen would need to be fed by hand, with sugar syrup made from whatever was available. The monastery kept a small supply of maple syrup. Danny began preparing the feed. He diluted the syrup with water in a 2-to-1 ratio. He filled a small feeder carved from a piece of wood. He inserted it into the hive through the entrance. Every 6 hours, day and night. At the same time, he turned his attention to the bumblebees. He removed the first bumblebee queen and 10 workers from the cradle. He placed them in a separate hive, a smaller one, with insulated walls. The bumblebees needed something different. More space for each individual. Fewer frames. A soft substrate on the bottom for the nest. He made them a little house out of an upside-down clay pot with a hole in it. The monks looked at the pot and shook their heads. Danny paid no attention. The days merged into a routine. Up before dawn, checking the beehive, feeding the queen, checking the bumblebee nest, working on new frames, repairing tools, studying the panel. The panel unlocked new tabs as the level increased. On the 3rd level, which Danny reached 10 days after his arrival, the Language of the Hive tab opened. He activated it, and the world changed. The bees dance. On Earth, Danny had studied it for years. A circular dance for nearby sources, a waggle dance for distant ones. The angle of the waggle indicates the direction relative to the sun. The speed of the waggle indicates the distance. He knew the theory, but hive language turned the theory into a direct translation. When the queen began her first trial dance inside the hive, the panel displayed the text. Source, southwest. Distance, 300 meters. Type, pollen, wild clover. Quality, low. The queen had found clover. Runaway. Without pollination, it didn't produce seeds, but it still produced pollen. That would be enough. The problem lay elsewhere. The queen couldn't fly for pollen herself. There was only one thing she could do: lay eggs. And wait. On the 12th day, she laid her first eggs. Danny opened the hive at dawn and saw them. Small, white, in neat cells. 32 eggs. The panel displayed the data. Fertilized. Worker bees. Development. 21 days until hatching. 21 days. 3 weeks. Danny counted the syrup supply. It was barely enough. He went to Benedict and asked him to send Tom to the nearest village for sugar or honey. Benedict replied that sugar cost a fortune, and no one has any honey. Danny thought for a moment. Then he asked if there were any fruit trees in the area. Benedict replied that there was an old apple orchard an hour's walk away. The trees were alive but not bearing fruit. 10 years without pollination. However, they still bloomed in the spring, out of habit, out of inertia. Flowers with no future. Danny asked if they were blooming now. Benedict said they should be. The season had just begun. Danny nodded. Apple blossoms produce nectar. Bees can collect the nectar and turn it into honey. But he didn't have any foraging bees yet, just the queen, and 32 eggs. But he did have bumblebees. He went back to the bumblebee hive. He opened the pot. The bumblebees had already settled in. They'd started building wax cells. They were feeding on syrup. They were active. The manna bumblebees turned out to be more resilient than he thought. And they could fly. Danny carried the pot out into the garden. He opened the entrance. The first bumblebee appeared in the opening a minute later. Large, hairy, dark gold. It rose into the air, heavily, hesitantly. It circled over the garden and flew off. The hive's language translated its movements instantly. Direction, southwest, searching for pollen. A second bumblebee followed the first, a third, a fourth. Danny stood in the middle of the garden and listened to the buzzing. Quiet, sparse. 4 bumblebees in the air. It was a negligible number for the whole world, but for the monastery garden it was like thunder after 10 years of silence. Benedict stood in the chapel doorway. Sister Lillian came out of the kitchen. Thomas froze with a bucket of water in his hands. Everyone listened. The buzzing. The living, real buzzing of insects in the air. Sister Lillian pressed her palms to her chest. She was tall, thin, with a tired, beautiful face and quiet gray eyes. Danny saw her every day. She cooked for the convent, she did the laundry, she mended clothes. She worked silently and hard. They didn't talk, but every morning when Danny went to the beehive, he found a clay mug of herbal tea at its door. Hot. No note, no explanation. He never once asked who left it. He knew. Now Lillian stood in the doorway and listened to the 4 bumblebees, and smiled, quietly, with just her lips. The first bumblebee returned an hour later, legs covered in pollen. The hive's tongue had translated. The source found. An apple tree. In bloom. Not particularly abundant. Distance. 800 meters. Southwest. Danny noted the direction. Tomorrow he'll go there himself. Look at the trees, assess the scale, and begin planning the first real pollination in 10 years. The apple orchard turned out to be larger than Danny expected. 40 trees on a gentle hillside, old, gnarled, with thick trunks and broad crowns. They were in bloom. Pale pink flowers covered the branches like snow, beautiful and useless. For 10 years, these trees had bloomed every spring. For 10 years, not a single fruit had set. The flowers opened. They waited for a pollinator. They didn't get one. They fell. And again, and again. The stubbornness of life. Danny walked among the trees and counted. 40 trees, about 200 flowers per tree in a good year. 8,000 flowers. Each needs 3 to 4 visits from a pollinator to set fruit reliably. 32,000 visits. He had 4 flying bumblebees. The math didn't add up. He needed more. Much more. He returned to the monastery and sat down to do the calculations. He drew with charcoal on a stone slab. In 3 weeks, the first worker man bees would hatch from the eggs. 32 of them, if they all survived. plus 10 active bumblebees, plus a second bumblebee queen in the cradle as a reserve. 42 pollinators for 8,000 flowers. Still not enough, but it's something. The issue was timing. The apple trees would bloom for another 2 or 3 weeks. The worker bees would emerge in 3. The windows barely overlapped. He needed to speed up the process. The panel suggested it. The cradle. Accelerated development function up to level 4, current level 3. Active interaction with 50 living pollinators is required to reach the next level. He had 38 in storage and 10 in the wild. 48 total. Too short. Danny rubbed the bridge of his nose. 2 individuals. He was 2 individuals short of the next level. He went out into the garden, activated the hive's sensors. 5 kilometers. He scanned. Bumblebees returning from their flight flashed on the radar as familiar dots. Bright. Warm. His own. And nothing new. He broadened his focus, concentrated on the weakest signals, the ones that could be mistaken for noise, for interference, like the echo of stone and wind. And to the south, at the very limit of sensitivity, 2 signals, weak, not pulsing like bees and bumblebees, flickering, rhythmic, like the beating of wings in flight, butterflies, or moths, something small and fragile. 2 kilometers to the south, not in the forest, in the open. He found Ja'a. She was sitting on a wall, sharpening arrowheads. He said he needed to go south, 2 kilometers. Ja'a asked what was there. He replied that there were 2 pollinators, most likely moths. Ja'a climbed down from the wall. She didn't ask why, she just went. They went out through the south gate. The landscape was different. Not hills, but a flat plain. Former fields, when grain and oilseeds used to grow here. Now everything was overgrown with weeds and thistles. The ruins of villages were visible on the horizon, abandoned, empty. People left when the land stopped feeding them. Ja'a walked in silence. Then she said that thousands of people used to live here. 3 villages, a market on Sundays, a fair at the end of summer. She remembered. She had been here with her father when she was 12. They bought honey in clay pots with wax seals. She fell silent. Danny didn't ask any questions. The signals grew stronger, closer, closer. They led him to the ruins of a stone building, something like a chapel or a small temple. The roof had collapsed. The walls were still standing. Inside, among the rubble and dust, flowers were growing. Pale, with long petals, night blooming. They were closed now in the daylight, but Danny recognized them from the descriptions on the panel. Moon jasmine, a magical plant. It blooms only at night, pollinated only by moths. Without pollination, it produces no seeds. Without seeds, it dies out. And somewhere here in these ruins, among the closed flowers, the last 2 moths were hiding. He activated the hive sense on a short-range radius. 10 meters. Maximum sensitivity. The signals were coming from under a stone slab in the corner. There was a crack under the slab. A cocoon in the crack. 2 cocoons. Danny lay down on the ground and peered into the crack. The cocoons were small, silvery white, as if woven from moonlight. The panel displayed the information. Species: lunar manna moth. Stage: pupa. Status: viable. Estimated time until emergence from the cocoon: 12 to 14 days. He carefully extracted both cocoons, placed them in the cradle. The panel updated. Cradle. Specimens: 40. Of those, active. 10 in stasis. 28 in the pupa stage. 2. Species. 3. Skill level. 4. Fourth level. He rose from the ground. He dusted himself off. New tabs opened on the panel. Accelerated development. Available. Allows for a 30% reduction in the development time of larvae and pupae, provided there is sufficient food. 30%. 21 days were reduced to 15. 15 days instead of 3 weeks. The apple trees would still be in bloom. The windows would overlap. Danny closed his eyes. He did the math in his head. In 15 days, 32 worker bees, plus 10 bumblebees already flying, plus, in 12 days, 2 moths for moon jasmine. 3 species, 3 functions. Daytime pollination, forest pollination, nighttime pollination. He was beginning to assemble an ecosystem, piece by piece, fragment by fragment. The return journey went without incident. News awaited them at the monastery. While they were walking toward the ruins, a woman arrived at the gate. Young, in a worn traveling cloak, with a leather bag slung over her shoulder. Benedict said she had come from the town of Redmore, a 2-day walk to the west. She said she had heard rumors of a monastery where bees were buzzing again. The woman's name was Evelyn Warren, an herbalist, an apothecary. She wore glasses with lenses made from a broken alchemical retort. They were uneven, cloudy, but through them her eyes seemed huge and attentive. She was sitting in the refectory drinking water. When Danny entered, she raised her head and looked at him, without enthusiasm, without fear, with professional interest. She said she hadn't come for a miracle. She'd come for science. That if he really kept bees, then he understood the ology of pollination. And if he understood pollination, he understood the toxicology of pollen. And she had been working with poisons and medicinal plants for 20 years. And that they could talk. Danny sat down across from her. He looked at her. Evelyn wasn't like the others. She didn't cry with joy. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't call him a savior. She sat calmly and waited for a sensible conversation. He asked what exactly she did. Evelyn answered. She had been a pharmacist in Redmore for the past 8 years. She treated people with herbs, infusions, decoctions. The problem was that without pollination, medicinal plants lost their potency with each passing year. Echinacea was only half as effective. Valerian didn't work at all. Anti-inflammatory mixtures had become placebos. She saw patients dying whom a single dose of the right decoction would have saved 10 years ago. Children with fevers, old people with ulcers, women in labor with hemorrhages. She spoke evenly, without a tremor in her voice, like a surgeon describing an operation. But Danny saw her hands. They lay on the table. Her fingers were slightly bent. Her knuckles were white. She was holding herself together through sheer willpower. Danny listened in silence. Then he said he could breed a strain of bees that would pollinate only medicinal plants. Purposefully. Specialized. It would take time, several months at least. A separate breeding line would be needed. A separate hive, controlled mating. But it was possible. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would stay, that she would help, that she knew every medicinal plant within a 3-day walk, every flowering season, every property. If he knew the bees, she knew the flowers. Together, they would close the cycle. Danny nodded. He held out his hand. Evelyn shook it. The handshake was firm, dry, businesslike. No romance, no reverence. 2 professionals had sealed a deal. That evening, Danny sat on the roof and thought. His community was growing. Benedict, Lillian, Toma, Renard, 2 more novices, Gia, now Evelyn. 9 people, 38 living pollinators of 3 species, 1 beehive, 1 bumblebee nest, 2 moth cocoons, an apple orchard a 20-minute walk away, ruins with moon jasmine an hour's walk away, the Black Forest a 2-hour walk away, and somewhere beyond his radar, a whole world that was slowly dying. The panel flashed. Accelerated development, activated for the current brood. Time until the first worker bees emerge. 14 days, 21 hours. He began the countdown. 14 days until the moment he could truly begin. 14 days until the first honey. 14 days until the dead apple trees bore fruit. He lay on his back and looked up at the sky. The stars were different. Not a single familiar constellation. A foreign sky. A foreign world. But the bees were the same. Egg, larva, pupa, bee. The life cycle hadn't changed. Not in Oregon, not in Arion. And that was the only thing he could hold on to. 14 days dragged on like tar. Danny didn't waste a single hour. Every morning began the same way. Getting up in the dark, checking the hive, feeding the queen, inspecting the brood through the screen, without opening the hive. Unnecessary interference stresses the colony. He knew this as well as he knew his own name. Then the bumblebees. Their nest in the clay pot was growing. The second queen was released from the cradle and placed in a separate pot. Now there were 2 bumblebee nests, 18 active bumblebees. They flew every day. They gathered pollen from apple trees and wild clover and thistles. They returned heavy, their legs covered in yellow dust. The hive's tongue translated their dances. A new source, northwest, 400 meters, wild sage, abundant nectar. Another one, south, 600 meters, dandelion, high-quality pollen. Danny marked each source on the map. He drew with charcoal on a smooth stone. The monastery in the center, points all around. Each point is a flower. Each flower is a resource. The map grew. Evelyn joined the mapping effort on the 3rd day. She brought her notes, a thick notebook with a leather cover. Every page was filled with small, neat handwriting. Medicinal plants of the region, where they grew, flowering seasons, properties, harvest times. She laid the notebook next to Danny's map and began to overlay her data. St. John's wort grew here. It blooms in a month. Wild chamomile here. It's already past its bloom. Here, the remnants of a lavender plantation, overgrown but still alive. Their maps complemented each other. The bumblebees showed what was blooming now. Evelyn knew what would bloom later. Together, they were building a pollination calendar, the first in 10 years. Gia wasn't sitting idle either. She went into the Black Forest every other day, alone. She returned with meat, rabbits, partridges. Once she hauled a whole deer on her shoulders. For the first time in years, the monastery ate its fill. But Gia didn't go into the forest just for meat. Danny asked her to look for signs of pollinators, old nests, remnants of honeycombs, dry cocoons, anything that would indicate where bees or bumblebees or moths had once lived. Gia nodded and didn't ask a single question. On the 7th day, she brought back a find, a piece of dark wax the size of a fist. She had carved it out of a crack in the rock deep in the forest. Danny took the wax and held it to his nose. The scent was faint but recognizable. Propolis. Old. Very old. Maybe 10 years old? He showed the wax to the panel. The system analyzed the composition. Manna bee wax, a subspecies, mountain manna bee, different from the queen found, a different gene pool, different characteristics. Mountain manna bees were adapted to high altitudes and cold. If any living specimens remained somewhere, this would be a second gene pool, a second line for crossbreeding, a safeguard against inbreeding. Danny asked Jia exactly where she had found the wax. Jia described the location, a rocky ledge on the northern edge of the Black Forest. High up, hard to reach. She had spotted the wax by chance while hiding from a pack of mutated wolves. Danny jotted down the coordinates. It wasn't time yet, but this information was worth its weight in gold. On the 10th day, the first problems arose. Danny was checking the brood through the panel and noticed an anomaly. 3 eggs out of 32 weren't developing. Condition: non-viable. Cause: genetic defect. Inbreeding. The queen was the sole survivor. She had mated 10 years ago with unknown drones. The sperm supply was running low. Genetic diversity was minimal, 3 out of 32, a 9% defect rate. Tolerable for the first generation, but with each subsequent generation, the percentage would rise. Without an influx of fresh genes, the colony would degenerate in 5 or 6 generations. Danny sat in his cell and looked at the data. He needed drones from another line. A mountain manna bee would be ideal. But he had no live mountain bees, just a piece of old wax. He closed the panel and rubbed his face with his palms. The problems were multiplying. Every solution opened up a new challenge. Every victory revealed 10 new fronts of work. On the 12th day, moths emerged from the cocoons. Danny took them out of the cradle in the evening when the sun went down. They were incredibly beautiful. Their wingspan was as wide as an adult man's palm. The wings were silvery white with a delicate pattern like frost on glass. Their bodies were fluffy. Their antennae were long and feathery. They sat on his palms and slowly unfolded their wings. Lillian stood nearby. She had come to watch. No one had asked her to. She was simply there. In the light of the last rays of sunset, the moths on Danny's palms began to glow. Softly, silvery, like 2 little... Lillian breathed in quietly. The next night, Danny carried the moths to the ruins of the temple with the moon jasmine. He walked alone. Jia offered to accompany him, but he refused. The moths were too fragile. Any noise could scare them away. He walked across the plain under the stars, carrying the 2 moths in the cradle. At the ruins, he released them. The moon jasmine bloomed in the darkness. White flowers with long, tubular corollas. The scent was heavy and sweet. The moths spread their wings and flew toward the flowers. Their silvery glow mingled with the glow of the petals. Their proboscis dived into the corollas. Pollen settled on their fuzzy bodies. The first moth flew to the second flower. It carried the pollen. Pollination. The first pollination of moon jasmine in 10 years. The panel confirmed it. Pollination successful. Plant. Moon jasmine. Status. Seeds forming. Estimated time to maturity? 40 days. Danny sat on a rock amid the ruins and watched as 2 moths danced among the flowers. Silver on white. Silence and light. He thought that if there was beauty worth getting stuck in a foreign world for, this was it. On the 14th day, the worker bees began to emerge. Danny didn't open the hive. He watched through the panel. The first pupa chewed through the cell cap at 6 in the morning. A young bee. Wet. Clumsy. She crawled out onto the surface of the comb and froze. She cleaned her antennae. She spread her wings. The second one emerged 20 minutes later. The third. The fourth. By evening, 29 out of 29 viable eggs had hatched. 29 worker bees, plus the queen. 30 bees in a single hive. Danny stood next to the hive and listened. The buzzing was soft but real, full, alive. It was the sound of a family, not a lone queen, not a dozen bumblebees. A family. Small, fragile, but real. In the morning, the young bees will begin their first flights, reconnaissance flights, memorizing, and in 3 days, they'll fly out for nectar, and the apple trees will finally have someone to carry their pollen. Danny turned toward the monastery courtyard. Everyone was standing there. Benedict, Lillian, Thomas, Renard, 2 other novices, Gia on the wall, Evelyn at the refectory door. 9 people were looking at the hive from which came the buzzing of 30 bees, and each of them understood that the world had just shifted, by a hair's breadth, by the width of a bee's wing, but it had shifted. The first honey came on the 26th day. Danny hadn't expected it so soon. The manna bees worked 3 times more efficiently than earth bees. Each worker carried twice as much nectar on a single foraging trip, and processed it twice as fast. Magic, literally. The nectar in the manna bee's crop underwent not only enzymatic processing, but also some kind of magical transformation. The resulting honey was different, not just sweet. It glowed, dimly, with a warm golden light visible only in the dark, and it smelled so good that Danny's throat tightened. His grandfather's honey from the apiary in Oregon. Thick, floral, with a hint of apple tree and wildflowers. The smell of home. He opened the hive at dawn, before the bees had begun their flight activity. He carefully pulled out the outermost frame. It was heavy. The combs were sealed with wax caps. That meant the honey was ripe. Danny cut off the caps with a thin knife. Honey dripped down the blade. Thick, sticky, golden with an amber sheen. He collected it in a clay pot that Tom had specially fashioned. It didn't amount to much. About 300 milliliters, a third of a liter. The first honey in 10 years on the entire continent. He stood in the garden with the pot in his hands, unsure what to do with it. To sell it meant to kickstart the economy. To give it away meant to start a legend. To keep it meant to build a reserve. There was no right answer. There was only his answer. He carried the pot to the refectory, set it on the table, sat down, called everyone. Benedict came first, then Lillian, Toma and Renard. 2 novices named Gilbert and Martin. Gia came last and stood by the wall with her arms crossed. Evelyn sat down across from Danny and looked at the pot. Danny said that this was the first honey, that there wasn't much of it, that every spoonful was worth its weight in gold, and that he wasn't going to sell it. Benedict asked what he was going to do. Danny replied that he wanted to give it to those who needed it most, to children. Benedict blinked. He asked what kind of children. Danny said he'd seen an outbuilding behind the monastery wall. Children lived there. Orphans. He'd caught a glimpse of them. Thin. Quiet. With eyes that held too little life for their age. How many were there? Benedict replied that there were 12, children from the surrounding villages. Their parents had died of starvation or left and never returned. The monastery fed them as best it could. Root vegetables, porridge made from crushed grain, sometimes meat when Zia brings some. But the children are growing weak. They get sick often. Without the vitamins and minerals from fruit, their bodies were slowly but surely breaking down. Danny picked up the pot and stood up. He walked toward the annex. The others followed him. He entered a long room with a low ceiling. 12 straw mattresses on the floor, a few wooden toys, charcoal drawings on the walls. Children's drawings, houses, trees, flowers. The children drew flowers they had never seen in real life, because there were flowers, but they bore no fruit, and the adults didn't consider them worth paying attention to. The children sat in a circle on the floor. 12 faces turned toward him. The oldest was about 11. The youngest was about 4. Danny crouched down. He placed a pot in front of him. He took out a wooden spoon. He scooped up some honey. He held it out to the youngest, a girl with dark eyes and thin braids. She looked at the spoon. She looked at Danny. She didn't understand what it was. She was born after Silent Spring. She had never tasted honey in her life. Danny nodded. The girl carefully took the spoon. She licked it. She froze. Her eyes widened. She licked it again, and began to eat greedily, hurriedly, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't know why she was crying. She was too young to understand. But her body knew. Something ancient and primal inside her responded to a taste that humanity had known for thousands of years. Sweetness. Real. Alive. Not from a root vegetable. Not from hard porridge. From a flower. Through a bee. Into honey. Danny fed the children one by one, a spoonful for each. 300 milliliters for 12 children, 25 milliliters each. A pittance. But every child ate, and something changed in their faces. An 8-year-old boy with a long scar on his cheek closed his eyes and smiled. 2 6-year-old twins exchanged glances and laughed. The oldest boy, 11 years old, took the spoon slowly and seriously. He tasted it. He didn't cry. He just nodded, as if confirming something he knew but couldn't prove, that the world wasn't completely broken, that sweetness still existed. Danny came out of the shed with an empty pot. Benedict was standing by the door. Lillian, Evelyn, G.A. They had seen everything. Benedict was silent. His face was calm. He was no longer crying. He had passed that point. The tears were over. Only determination remained. He looked at Danny and said he would write letters to every monastery and every temple and every village within a 3-day journey, to tell that the bees have returned, that honey exists, that hope is not an empty word. Danny nodded. Then he said he would wait to send the letters, that the news must spread slowly, because once the news spreads, it won't just be those in need of hope who come. Those in need of control will come. Benedict asked who he had in mind. Danny replied that he didn't know specifically, but that a pot of honey in a world without honey is not just food, it is power. And power is always sought by those who want to monopolize it. He turned out to be right sooner than he expected. 4 days after the first honey, a horseman rode up to the monastery, on a fine horse, in an expensive cloak, with a silver brooch on his chest. The brooch depicted a bee against the backdrop of a wax candle. Benedict saw this brooch and turned pale. He whispered 2 words to Danny. The order. Silver wax. The horseman dismounted. He introduced himself. His name was Victor Rain, sales representative for the Order of Silver Wax, Southern District. He smiled, broadly, professionally, like a man who smiles for money. He said that surprising rumors had reached the order, that bees were buzzing again at the monastery of St. Apollo, that some stranger was performing miracles, that there was honey. The order was, of course, interested. The order had always been the patron of beekeeping. The order would like to offer its assistance, partnership, protection, resources. Danny stood in the garden in his wax-splattered apron, shavings in his hair, hands covered in propolis. He looked at this slick horseman and saw before him all the corporate buyers who had once tried to buy his grandfather's apiary in Oregon. The same smiles, the same gleam in their eyes, the same word, partnership, which meant takeover. Danny asked what exactly the order was offering. Victor spoke, smoothly, confidently. The order provides security for the monastery, funding, building materials, trade routes for future honey, specialist alchemists for processing. In return, the order receives the exclusive right to trade all honey produced at the monastery, plus the right to approve new apiaries, plus a detailed description of breeding methods. Danny listened, nodded. Then he replied, "No." One word. Victor didn't stop smiling. He asked if Danny wanted to think over the proposal. Danny replied that he had thought it over. No. Victor's smile faded. Beneath it was a different face, harsh, professional. He said that the order preferred cooperation, but that the order also knew how to get what it wanted by other means, that the monastery was far from the nearest town, that the roads were dangerous, that anything could happen to the hive where the world's last bee colony lived. Danny looked him in the eye, without blinking. Zia stood by the wall, her hand rested on her bow. Danny told Victor he could leave, that the offer was rejected, and that if anyone from the order approached his hives, he'd know about it from 5 kilometers away. Because every bee in those hives is his eyes and ears, and they never sleep. Victor mounted his horse. He rode off without looking back. Danny stood at the gate and watched him go. Evelyn came up behind him. She said quietly that he had just made himself a very serious enemy. Danny replied that he knew, and that he needed more bees, many more. Because if the order returns, it won't be with just one horseman. After Victor's visit, Danny changed his routine. Safety first. He set up an early warning system using bumblebees. 4 patrol routes: north, south, east, west. The bumblebees flew in circles with a 2-kilometer radius. The hive's language translated their observations in real time. Large animal to the west, distance 1.5 kilometers, moving toward the monastery, slow speed, herbivore, or a group of people. Southeast, 1 kilometer, 4 individuals moving along the road. It was crude and primitive, but it worked. Anyone approaching the monastery within the bumblebee patrol's range would show up on Danny's radar. Gia assessed the system. She said it was better than any sentry. A sentry falls asleep. A bumblebee doesn't. Danny nodded and turned to the second task, reproduction. The queen laid a new batch of eggs every 5 days. The first generation was already flying, 29 workers. The second generation was in the larval stage, 35 eggs. This time, 4 were non-viable. The defect rate had risen. Inbreeding was taking its toll. He needed a mountain manna bee, urgently. He called for Gia. He laid out a map in front of her. He pointed to the spot where she had found the old wax. He asked if it was possible to reach the rocky outcrop and examine it thoroughly. Gia looked at the map. She said the place was dangerous. High up. The rocks were wet. A ravine below. And nearby was the territory of a pack of mutated wolves. 4 or 5 of them. Large. Fast. With poisonous claws. Danny asked if there was another way. Gia thought about it. She said there was a detour across the stream. 3 hours longer, but safer. They set out at dawn. Evelyn tagged along with them. She said mountain thyme grew by the rocks, a rare medicinal plant. She needed samples. Jur-Ah looked at the herbalist skeptically. Evelyn looked at the hunter with polite indifference. Danny decided not to get involved. The journey took 5 hours, through the black forest, along a bypass trail beside a stream, and up a rocky slope. Zia led the way. Danny followed her. Evelyn brought up the rear. She walked more slowly, but didn't complain or ask to stop. She just walked, methodically, stubbornly, like someone accustomed to long treks between villages with a heavy bag of medicine. A rocky ledge hung over the ravine at a height of 30 meters. Below, the stream roared. The walls were wet with spray. Moss and lichen covered every stone. Danny activated the hive sense of the hive. Maximum sensitivity. Nearby radius. He scanned the rock meter by meter. Cracks, crevices, niches. Nothing. 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 He climbed higher. Zia belayed him with a rope tied to a tree root. The rock slipped beneath his feet. Danny clung to ledges and continued scanning. 20 meters above the stream, he found a crack. Narrow, vertical, deep, warm inside. Wax residue on the walls. And at the very bottom, cells. Queen cells. Empty, dry, dead. But next to the queen cells, on a tiny ledge inside the crack, something stirred. Danny froze, held his breath, pressed himself against the rock, activated the hive sense for an ultra-short range, centimeters. And he sensed it. A single individual, a worker bee, a mountain manna bee. Old. Very old. The last of a dead colony. She had crawled deep into the crack and was slowly dying. A worker bee, not a queen. A worker bee cannot found a new colony, cannot lay fertilized eggs, cannot create new queens. Under normal circumstances, a lone worker bee is useless. But Danny wasn't an ordinary beekeeper. The panel displayed the data. Mountain manna bee, worker, age, 3 years, critical condition, genetic profile, recorded, compatibility with current population, high. He carefully slipped his hand into the crack. His fingers felt a tiny body, cold, barely alive. He placed it in the cradle. The panel updated. Individuals, 41. Species, 3. Subspecies, 2. Genetic lines, 2. 2 genetic lines. That was the main thing. The worker bee couldn't reproduce, but her genetic profile was recorded in the system. And when Danny reached skill level 5, the controlled mating tab would unlock. The ability to direct the genetics of the next generation using the recorded profiles. He didn't need a live mountain queen. He only needed the genetic code. And he got it. The descent was worse than the climb. The rock was slippery, the rope rubbed his palms raw, but Danny made it down in one piece. Jia caught him by the shoulder when he slipped on the last meter. Silently. Firmly. She let go immediately. Evelyn was sitting on a rock, sorting through bunches of thyme. She looked at Danny. She asked if he'd found it. He nodded. 1. A worker. Evelyn frowned. She said that a worker bee doesn't produce offspring. Danny replied that he didn't need a bee. He needed its genome. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Then she nodded slowly. She understood. The return trip took 6 hours. They walked in silence, tired. But the mood was different, lighter. Jia even spoke first. She asked why he needed 2 lines of bees. Danny explained about inbreeding, about genetic diversity, about how without an influx of fresh genes, a colony degenerates within a few generations, that this applies to any living creature, bees, people, anyone. Jia listened, Then she said that her clan had died out because it was small. 120 people. A closed community. When the mutants attacked, there weren't enough people to defend themselves. If they had lived near other clans, if they had mixed, there would have been more of them. They would have survived. She paused, added that she understood about inbreeding. Not in bees, in humans. Danny looked at her. It was the first time she'd said more than one sentence about her clan. He didn't comment. He just nodded. Another piece of news awaited them at the monastery. While they'd been in the mountains, Tom had ridden to the nearest village for salt. And he'd brought back more than just salt. He'd brought back a rumor. In the town of Edmure, where Evelyn came from, people are talking about bees. They say the monastery of St. Apollo is blessed, that a stranger has brought back honey. They say different things, some with hope, others with skepticism, still others with greed. And Tom also heard that people wearing silver brooches had appeared at the market. They were buying information, asking about the roads to the monastery, about the number of monks, about the guards. The order wasted no time. Danny listened to Tom. He thanked him. He went to his cell. He sat down on the mattress. He opened the panel. Level 4. To reach level 5, he needed to raise 100 living pollinators. He had 41 specimens. 59 were missing. The second generation of manna bees. 31 viable larvae. In 10 days, they'll become workers. That makes 72. Still 28 short. Third generation. The queen will lay eggs in 4 days, if at least 30 hatch from them. 72 plus 30, 102. Level 5. Controlled mating. Solving the inbreeding problem. 3 weeks. He needs to hold out for 3 weeks until level 5. And during those 3 weeks, the order will keep turning up the pressure. Danny closed the panel. He lay down on the mattress. He stared at the ceiling with its lightning-shaped crack. He said aloud in Korean a long word his mother had forbidden him to say in front of his grandmother. Then he rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be a new day. New problems, new solutions. As always. The 3 weeks flew by under the pressure. Every day brought growth and threat at the same time. The second generation of worker bees emerged right on schedule. 31 individuals, all healthy. They joined the colony and began their foraging work on the second day. The apple trees were being pollinated. Danny went to the orchard every 3 days to check the trees. On the 7th day, after mass pollination began, he saw what he was looking for. Buds. Small, green, firm, the size of a pea. Where there had once been empty blossoms, future apples were now growing. 40 trees. Not all the flowers were pollinated, maybe a third. But a third meant thousands of buds, thousands of fruits. The first fruit harvest in 10 years. Benedict didn't cry when Danny showed him the buds. He just stood there and touched the little green pea on the branch of the old apple tree. He stroked it with his finger like a baby's head. Evelyn began working on medicinal plants. She planted around the monastery beds of echinacea, chamomile, and calendula from seeds she had saved for years. The seeds were old, perhaps no longer viable, but she planted them, and bumblebees began to fly over the beds. 2 weeks later, the first shoots appeared. Weak, pale, but alive. Evelyn crouched next to an echinacea sprout and jotted down her observations in her notebook. Her face was focused and calm, a professional at work. Meanwhile, problems were mounting. Tom brought news from the village. People in silver brooches were still lurking around. They were buying up food, blocking trade routes. 2 merchants carrying salt to the monastery were robbed on the road. The salt was taken. The merchants were left unharmed, but warned. The monastery of St. Apollon was under quarantine. Anyone who traded with them was trading against the order. Danny found out about this and gritted his teeth. A blockade. A silent one, unofficial, but effective. The monastery could feed itself, meat from Gia, root vegetables from the garden, water from the stream. But without salt and without trade, they were cut off. And the children needed more than root vegetables and meat. They needed flour, oil, cloth for clothing, medicines, of which Evelyn had fewer and fewer. On the 15th day, a woman came to the monastery, young, in an expensive but worn traveling dress, with a leather satchel, in gloves of faded silk. She was dirty, tired. Her feet were bloodied. She had been walking for 2 days, alone, along roads ruled by the order. Her name was Margaret Ashford. Benedict recognized the surname. The Ashfords were one of Arion's oldest families of aristocratic beekeepers. Before the Silent Spring, they owned the largest apiary in the southern district. 700 hives, 20 varieties of honey. Their golden bees were legendary. Then, everything died. The bees, the apiary, the fortune, reputation. Margaret told her story in the dining hall. She spoke calmly, back straight, chin up, an aristocratic bearing that neither poverty nor filth nor worn-out feet could kill. Her father, Edward Ashford, survived the Silent Spring. He tried to rebuild the apiary for 7 years. He gave up everything. The land, the house, the family silver. Everything went toward trying to find surviving bees. He didn't find any. 3 years ago, he walked into his empty apiary, sat down on a bench among the dead hives, and didn't come out. Margaret found him in the morning. She didn't say how he died. She didn't have to. Everyone understood. After her father's death, Margaret was left alone, without money, without land, without a family. She lived with distant relatives. She worked as a copyist. She wore her grandmother's gloves, the only thing left from her former life. And she waited. She didn't know for what. She just waited. Then she heard a rumor. A man at the monastery of St. Apollon had returned the bees, and she went, through the order's territory, alone. 2 days, because if it was true, she had to be there. Danny listened in silence. When she finished, he asked only one thing. Did she have her father's records? Margaret blinked. She opened her suitcase. She took out a bundle of papers tied with string. Edward Ashford's records. Pedigree books of golden bees. Characteristics. Breeding lines. Records from his grandfather and great-grandfather. 4 generations of breeding work. On paper. Dead information without living bees, but priceless information. Danny took the records. He skimmed the first few pages. His eyes widened. The Ashford golden bees were not just a breed. It was an elite line with unique characteristics. Increased honey production, resistance to fungal diseases, and most importantly, the ability to pollinate deep flowers, tubular ones, the ones ordinary bees couldn't reach because of the length of their proboscis. The Ashford golds had an elongated proboscis, a genetic mutation cemented by 4 generations of selective breeding. Danny looked up. He looked at Margaret. He said he would find her bee. Margaret didn't flinch. She asked how. All the Ashford golds were dead. 10 years. Not a single one had survived. Her father had searched for 7 years and hadn't found one. Danny replied that her father didn't have what he had. He pointed to his eyes. The sense of the hive. 5 kilometers. Soon more. If even a single Ashford golden bee had survived somewhere on this continent, he would find her. Margaret looked at him. For the first time, her aristocratic mask cracked. Her lips trembled. She clenched her gloved fingers. Then she straightened up, nodded, said she would stay, that she would work, that she knew how to keep records and count and organize, that she could be useful. Danny nodded. That evening he sat on the roof and counted the people. Benedict, Lillian, Toma, Renard, Gilbert, Martin, Gia, Evelyn, Margaret. 12 children, 21 people, 31 first-generation Manna Bee workers, 31 second-generation workers, 1 queen, 2 bumblebee nests with 20 bumblebees, 2 moon moths, 1 mountain manna in stasis, 86 pollinators, 14 short of 100. The third generation of bees was in the larval stage, 36 of them. They'll emerge in a week, 86 plus 30, if 30 out of 36 survive. 116, level 5. He looked at the stars. Alien, unfamiliar. Somewhere beyond that sky lay Oregon, his grandfather's apiary, 200 hives on the hillside. He closed his eyes, opened them. The alien stars hadn't gone anywhere. He got up and went to sleep. He had work tomorrow. Level 5 opened on a quiet Tuesday. No fanfare, no flashes of light. Just in the morning, when the third generation of worker bees began emerging from their cells, the panel flickered and updated. Hivekeeper, Level 5. New features available. Controlled mating. Second-order selection. Expansion of the hive sense to 10 kilometers. Danny sat on a bench in the garden and read the descriptions. Controlled mating. Allows the use of recorded genetic profiles for targeted crossbreeding. The next generation queen can be fertilized with combined genetic material from several recorded lines. He read it twice, then 3 times. This meant that the genetic profile of the mountain manna bee could be passed on to the next generation. Without a living drone, without physical mating, the system took the recorded code and wove it into the genetics of the new eggs. Inbreeding solved. He leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes. He exhaled. 10 kilometers. A new radius. He turned the hive sense up to full power. The world doubled in size. Before, he could see 5 kilometers around the monastery. Now 10. Familiar dots of bumblebees and honeybees flickered nearby, bright, warm. And further on, at the edge of the new radius, signals. Weak, scattered, but numerous. To the east, 7 kilometers away, something crawling. Many small dots. Not bees, not bumblebees, something else. Pollinating beetles, perhaps, or buzzing flies. 9 kilometers to the southwest. A single signal. Large, powerful, unlike anything familiar. The queen of something. He couldn't tell exactly what from such a distance. 8 kilometers to the north, deep in the Black Forest. Another group, 5 or 6 individuals. A familiar rhythm. Like bees. Mountain man bees. Alive. Not just a single half-dead worker. A group. Possibly with a queen. His breath caught in his throat. He stood up. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the scale of it. The world that seemed dead turned out not to be quite dead. Life was hiding. In cracks, in hollows, in the crevices of rocks and burrows under stones. Rare, fragile, scattered, but alive. The silent spring hadn't killed them all. It had killed 99 9/10%. But the remaining 1/10% clung to existence with that desperate stubbornness that Danny knew from the bees on Earth. A small swarm on a branch in the January frost, a queen in the wall of an abandoned house, a bumblebee nest under the rubble of a concrete slab. Life doesn't give up. Never. He gathered everyone in the dining hall. Benedict, Lillian, Toma, Renard, Gilbert, Martin, Gia, Evelyn, Margaret. He unfolded the map, plotted new points. 3 expeditions, 3 directions, 3 species of unknown pollinators. Gia looked at the marker in the Black Forest. She said that 8 kilometers was deep. That was the territory of large beasts, mutant deer, black boars, tree spiders. Risky. Evelyn looked at the southwestern marker. She said that the ruins of the city of Valheim lay in that direction, abandoned 12 years ago after an epidemic of magical plague, a place with a bad reputation. Margaret looked toward the east. She said that the former estates of the Cross family lay there, once allies of her family, now abandoned, perhaps occupied by bandits or deserters. Danny listened. He nodded. Every expedition is a risk. Every new species is a step toward recovery. He couldn't do all 3 at once. He chose the closest and least dangerous. East, the former Cross estates. 7 kilometers. Pollinator beetles. Margaret volunteered to go. She said she knew the estates. She'd been there as a child. Danny looked at her. Margaret stood straight, her grandmother's gloves on her hands, chin lifted. Behind her calmness lay a need to be useful, not to sit and wait, to act. He nodded. Gia would go too, for safety. They set out in the morning, the 3 of them, Gia in front, Danny in the middle, Margaret behind. They walked eastward across empty fields and overgrown roads. Margaret told them stories along the way. The Crosses were a merchant family, not beekeepers, merchants. They traded in grain and cloth. They owned 3 estates, the trade route. They were friends with the Ashfords. They bought honey from them in bulk. When Silent Spring destroyed the harvest, the Crosses were the first to go bankrupt. Grain won't grow without pollination. The weaving workshops ground to a halt without flax. The family scattered. Some went to the cities, some disappeared. The estates stand empty. Margaret fell silent. Then she added that Mrs. Cross had given her a doll when she was 5, a porcelain one, in a blue dress, the only toy she ever had. She still keeps it. Gia didn't turn around, but her pace slowed for a moment. 3 hours later, they reached the estates, 3 stone buildings on a hill. The roofs had sagged, the walls were cracked. The surrounding garden had grown so overgrown that the trees had merged into an impenetrable wall. But a path to the main house had been trodden down. Someone had been here. Gia raised her fist. They stopped. She examined the tracks on the ground. She said they were human, fresh, 2 or 3 days old. 2 or 3 people. Light, no heavy gear. Not bandits. More likely gatherers or vagabonds. Danny activated the hive sense. The signals were nearby, 100 meters away, in the overgrown garden, a multitude of small dots. He made his way toward them through the thicket. Gia provided cover. Margaret followed cautiously, pushing aside the branches so as not to tear her gloves. Deep in the garden stood an old fountain, not working, overgrown with moss. And beetles sat on the fountain's stones, small ones, with iridescent sheen on their elytra. Dozens, maybe 100. They crawled over the stone and the moss and the petals of the wild bindweed that had entwined the fountain. The panel displayed the data. Species: iridescent manna beetle. Class: Coleoptera, hard-winged pollinators. Individuals: 112. Queen: absent. Social structure: None. Solitary pollinators. Reproduction. Lay eggs in the soil. Do not require a hive. Function. Pollination of low-growing flowers and ground-cover plants. Danny read the data and smiled. Beetles. Simple little beetles. Not bees with their complex social structure. Not bumblebees with their nests. Solitaries. Each on its own, but each a pollinator. 112 beetles are 112 worker units that need neither a hive nor a queen nor care. Release them into the field and they will pollinate, automatically, because that's how they're built. He began gathering the beetles into the cradle, carefully, one by one. Not all of them, 50. Let the rest live here. The population must be preserved in the wild. Never take everything. Leave some behind. The first rule of ecology. While he worked, Jia stood guard. Margaret sat down nearby and watched. Then she asked quietly, "He always works like this, carefully, as if every beetle were a treasure." Danny didn't look up. He replied that every beetle is a treasure. That in a world where pollinators have gone extinct, a single beetle is worth more than a gold bar. Margaret fell silent. Then she said, even more quietly, "Her father used to say the same thing, about bees. Every bee is a treasure." She turned away. Danny saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her glove, quickly, so no one would notice. He noticed. He didn't say anything. The return trip was uneventful. No bandits, no creatures. They returned by evening. Danny refreshed the panel. Cradle. Individuals. 136. Species. 4. Subspecies. 2. Genetic lines. 3. 4 species. Manna bees. Manna bumblebees. Moon moths. Rainbow manna beetles. He was beginning to assemble an ecosystem. 4 elements out of the hundreds that once filled Arion. But 4 living elements in a dead world is no longer 0. It is already a beginning. That same evening, he activated controlled mating. He selected a manna bee queen. He selected the genetic profile of the mountain line. He started the process. The panel displayed the result. The next generation. Hybrid manna bees. Characteristics. Increased frost resistance. Extended flight range. Reduced genetic defect rate. 0.3% instead of 9. He could work with that. Danny closed the panel. He looked at the ceiling of his cell. A lightning-shaped crack. He had already gotten used to it. He didn't even notice it anymore. Just like you stop noticing a crack in the ceiling of your own home. Home. He thought about that word. The monastery was becoming a home. Slowly, imperceptibly, through the smell of wax and the sound buzzing and the clay mug of herbal tea by the door every morning. Lillian, she still didn't speak to him any more than was necessary, but every morning the mug stood by the door, hot, without a note. He began leaving hers in return, small twigs with flowers, apple blossoms pollinated by his bees, with buds, alive. He left them by the door to her cell, early in the morning, before she got up. No note, silently. She found the first twig and said nothing. The second one, too. The third, the fourth. On the 5th day, Danny happened to see through the open door of the cell. On a shelf by the wall stood a small clay vase. In it were 4 twigs with buds, dried, neatly arranged, preserved. He turned away and left, and smiled all the way to the hive. 2 months. Danny had been at Arion for 2 months. The monastery had changed beyond recognition. 20 hives stood along the south wall of the garden. Frame hives, Langstroth designs, each numbered, each with a separate colony. Fourth-generation hybrid manabees flew over the apple orchard and returned heavy with nectar. The bumblebee nests had grown to 5. 40 bumblebees patrolled the surroundings. Rainbow beetles were settled among Evelyn's garden beds and pollinated the medicinal herbs. There were now 8 moths. They flew at night as silvery dots over the field of moon jasmine that stretched from the ruins all the way to the road. Honey was now harvested every week, not by the leader, not yet by the leader, but enough to feed the children every day, a spoonful in the morning, a spoonful in the evening. The children were changing. Their pale faces were filling with color. Their quiet voices were growing louder. The youngest girl, the one who had been the first to taste the honey, began to laugh. Not just smile. Laugh. Loudly and heartily. Lillian said she hadn't heard a child's laughter in the monastery for 3 years. The apple trees bore fruit. Small, sour, wobbly, but real. Apples. The first in 10 years. Tom took a basket to the village and returned with the look of a man who had witnessed a miracle. People were crying. They grabbed apples and pressed them to their chests. One old woman took a bite and stood with her eyes closed for 10 minutes, not chewing, just holding the piece in her mouth, remembering the taste. Rumors spread. Danny couldn't stop them and stopped trying. Every week people came to the monastery. Refugees, vagrants, former farmers, former merchants. Everyone had heard the same thing. The monastery of St. Apollo. Bees, honey, hope. Danny couldn't take everyone in. The monastery isn't made of rubber. But he began selecting students, people with patience, with steady hands, with a willingness to learn. 4 of them. 2 former farmers, 1 carpenter, 1 widow who, back when, once kept a log-type apiary. He taught them from scratch, the construction of a frame hive, bee space, 8 millimeters, no more, no less. Inspecting the queen, brood control, feeding, swarming tendencies, and how to prevent them. They listened with their mouths agape. To them, this wasn't beekeeping. It was sacred knowledge. Danny corrected them every time. It's not magic. It's science. It's biology. It's observation and patience and respect for a living creature. They nodded and still looked at him as if he were a prophet. Margaret took charge of the organization. Her aristocratic upbringing proved useful. She kept track of the hives. She recorded the metrics for each colony. She calculated expenses and income. She drew up inspection schedules. Her handwriting was perfect, neat, calligraphic. The Ashfords' records lay next to the new journals, past and present on the same table. She worked 16 hours a day. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for praise. She just did it. Danny saw this and one evening left a jar of honey at her door. Top quality, apple blossom. With a note. For Margaret. For her work. In the morning, the jar was sitting on her desk. Empty, washed. The note lay next to it. Thank you. The honey is just like my father's. Just 4 words. Danny tucked the note into his pocket and didn't take it out all day. Evelyn was working alongside her. Her garden beds were turning green. The echinacea had grown knee-high. The chamomile was blooming. The calendula was forming buds. Bumblebees pollinated every day. The first real medicinal harvests in 10 years. Evelyn prepared decoctions and tested their effects, carefully, methodically. The anti-inflammatory mixture worked at 60% of its pre-war potency. Weak, but it worked. She treated children for colds, and for the first time in years, the treatment actually helped. The order wasn't sitting idle. The blockade had tightened. All trade routes to the monastery were cut off. The salt was gone. The flour was gone. Fabric was gone. Jia provided meat, but even she couldn't feed 30 people every day. Danny knew this was pressure. Slow. Calculated. The order didn't attack. The order was suffocating them, waiting for the monastery to surrender on its own. And then So Yun arrived. She appeared at night, alone, without a horse, in a dark, hooded cloak. The Bumblebee Patrol spotted her 2 kilometers away. Danny was waiting at the gate when she approached. She threw back her hood. A beautiful face. Cold. With high cheekbones and dark eyes in which there was nothing soft. A silver chain around her neck. A symbol on the chain. A bee against the background of a candle. The symbol of the Order of Silver Wax. Jia raised her bow. Danny raised his hand. He waited. The woman looked at him. Then she slowly reached for the chain. She pulled it over her head. She threw it on the ground. And she said her name was So Yun Cho, that she had been the high priestess of the Order of the Silver Wax. Had been. The past. That she had information he needed, and that for this information, the Order would kill her if they found her. Danny looked at the silver insignia on the ground, then at the woman. He asked what information. So Yun answered in 2 sentences. Silent Spring was no accident. The Order knows who orchestrated it, and has known from the very beginning. Silence fell over the monastery courtyard like a stone dropped into a well. Danny invited her inside. So Yun spoke for 3 hours. They sat in the refectory. Danny, Benedict, Evelyn, Jia, Margaret. Lillian stood by the door and listened. So Yun spoke in an even voice, without pauses and without emotion, like someone who had rehearsed this speech dozens of times in their own head. 12 years ago, the Order of Silver Wax faced a problem. Wild swarms of mana bees were spiraling out of control. Having multiplied during the warm years, the bees attacked the Order's apiaries. They stole honey. They killed the domestic queens. Wild nature was triumphing over order. Trade was suffering losses. The supreme keeper of wax, Cedric Mole, made a decision. He found an old mage named Geron, the last of an ancient order of summoners. Geron knew how to summon creatures from other worlds, not demons, not gods. People, with specific skills. Cedric commissioned Geron to summon a man capable of destroying the wild pollinators. All of them. Everywhere. Forever. So that only those in the Order's decks would remain. Controlled. Obedient. Profitable. Geron performed a ritual and summoned Marcus, a chemist from another world. Marcus received the skill Guardian of Silence, the ability to exterminate pollinating insects on a continental scale, through targeted biological poisons, through pheromone traps, through magical infection. The skill was a mirror image of Danny's skill, the same principle, the same precision, the same specialization, but death instead of life. Marcus worked for 2 years, methodically, professionally. He created a biological weapon, a magical plague that killed only pollinators, only them, no one else. Perfect selectivity. Cedric was thrilled. The plan was this: to destroy the wild pollinators, to leave only the Order's bees in protected hives. A monopoly. Absolute. Forever. But something went wrong. The plague spiraled out of control. It was supposed to strike only the wild specimens. Instead, it killed them all. Wild, domestic, sacred. every last one, in a single spring. Silent spring. Marcus realized what he had done. And he vanished. He went north. Cedric covered his tracks, hid the evidence, destroyed the archives, blamed it all on God's wrath and a magical war. 10 years. For 10 years the Order remained silent. For 10 years Cedric watched as the world died from what he himself had wrought. And he told no one, because the truth meant the end of the Order, the end of his power, the end of his life. The old mage Jaren knew the truth. He was tormented by guilt for 10 years. Before his death, he performed one final ritual, the summoning of the antidote. Instead of a killer, he summoned a healer. Instead of the keeper of silence, he summoned the keeper of the hive. Jaren died the moment he summoned them. His last words were not addressed to the gods, but to the person he had summoned, to Danny. Forgive me. Fix what I broke. So Yoon fell. Silence hung in the refectory. Benedict sat as white as a sheet. His lips moved without sound. A prayer or a curse. Evelyn took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. Her hands were perfectly still, but Danny saw a muscle throbbing at her temple. Jia stood by the wall. Her face showed nothing, but her right hand rested on the hilt of a knife, and her fingers had turned white. Margaret sat motionless. Her eyes were dry. She already knew. Not the details, but the essence. Her father had been looking for the bees for 7 years and hadn't found them because someone had killed them on purpose. She knew that feeling when a suspicion turns into a fact, when a hunch becomes the truth. It's not shock, it's confirmation. Lillian, by the door, quietly pressed her palm against the wall, as if seeking support. Danny sat and said nothing. Inside him, there was emptiness. Not anger, not despair. Emptiness. Like a beehive from which all the frames had been cut out. He hadn't ended up here by accident. Not by the will of fate. Not by the will of the gods. He had been summoned by a dying old man to correct a mistake he had helped make. His skill was not a gift. It was an instrument of atonement, created by the one who had created the catastrophe. He asked So-Yoon one thing. Where is Marcus? So-Yoon replied that, according to the Order, Marcus lives in an abandoned tower in the northern wastelands, beyond the Black Forest, beyond the mountains, a 3-week journey away. He isn't hiding, he simply left. And he waits. So-Yoon didn't know exactly what he was waiting for. Maybe death, maybe forgiveness, maybe someone who would come to stop him, or to continue. Danny stood up. He thanked So-Yoon. He said she could stay if she wanted to. So-Yoon looked at him for a long time. She asked why he trusted her. She had served those who killed his bees for 10 years. Danny replied that he didn't trust her, but that she had nowhere else to go, and that a person without a home is worse off than a person with a suspicious past. So-Yoon nodded. For the next 3 days, Danny spoke to no one but the bees. He conducted inspections. He fed them. He took notes. He worked. Silently. Mechanically. Everyone saw him and left him alone. Even Jia. On the 4th day, he went out onto the roof at night. He sat down. He looked at the unfamiliar stars. And he began to talk to his grandfather. Quietly, in Korean. He told him everything. About a world without bees, about the queen under the fountain, about the bumblebees in the hollow, about the moths, about the honey he gave to the children. about the old man who summoned him and died, about the other guy from another world who killed all the bees on the planet, about how his skill was someone else's guilt remolded into a tool. Then he fell silent, for a long time. The stars were silent in response. Danny stood up. He climbed down from the roof. He went to the refectory. He gathered everyone. He said 3 things. First, he won't go to Marcus. Not now. Right now, his place is here, next to the hives, next to the people. Second, the Order is attacking. Soon. So Yun confirmed it. Cedric knows she's gone, knows the truth has come out. He won't wait. Third, they need to prepare. The preparations took 2 weeks. Danny worked day and night. He had a plan. Not a military one. He didn't know how to fight. He knew how to do something else. To think like a beekeeper. First, defense. He bred a new species. Combat man bees. Not killers. He didn't want to kill. The selection process spanned 5 generations of accelerated development. Each generation was selected based on a single criterion, the composition of the venom. Ordinary man bees stung painfully but harmlessly. Combat man bees stung differently. Their venom caused not pain but drowsiness, deep and instantaneous. A person stung by such a bee would fall asleep within 30 seconds. The sleep lasted 4 to 6 hours, harmless, without consequences, but with one side effect: dreams. Vivid, detailed. Dreams of blooming meadows and the buzzing of bees and the scent of honey. Everyone who was stung woke up feeling as though they had visited the world as it was before Silent Spring. Danny didn't know why the bees had added this detail to their venom. Maybe magic. Maybe instinct. Maybe a message. He didn't ask. He accepted it as it was. 3 hives of warrior bees stood on the monastery roof. 240 bees, ready to defend. Second, evacuation. Danny couldn't risk all the hives. If the Order broke through and destroyed the apiary, everything would be lost. All his work, all the breeds, all the lines. He divided the collection. 10 hives remained at the monastery. Gia and Tom moved 10 hives to 3 secret locations in the Black Forest. Gia knew places even the mutants didn't venture. Deep ravines, rock niches, hollows in old trees. Each hiding place contained queens and workers from at least 2 genetic lines. A safety net. If the monastery fell, life would go on. Third, allies. Margaret wrote letters, 12 of them. She sent them out with wandering merchants who were still passing by. The letters went to those who still remembered the Ashfords, to former partners, to old friends, to people who once bought honey from her father. She wrote the truth. The bees have returned. There is honey. The Order wants to destroy it. We need help. Not everyone would reply. Maybe no one would reply. But she wrote. So Yun worked too. She knew the Order's rituals, knew their weak spots, knew the patrol schedules and supply routes and the names of the spies. She exposed 2 informants in the village who were reporting to the Order. They didn't neutralize them. Instead, they started feeding them false information through Toma. The hives have been moved east. Danny has left. The monastery is empty. Let the Order plan its strike into a void. Evelyn was preparing medicines. If there is a fight, there will be wounded. She gathered a supply of bandages, anti-inflammatory decoctions, pain-relieving infusions. She worked silently and methodically, as always. But one evening, Danny came to her for burn ointment and saw her sitting at the table, staring at the wall, motionless. Her eyes were red. He asked what was wrong. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then she said that in the 10 years since Silent Spring, 117 people had died in Redmore alone from ineffective medicines. People she could have saved. 117. She knew each one by name. She kept a list. And now she knows that those deaths weren't inevitable. They weren't God's will. They were the result of one man's decision, Cedric Mall, who wanted to sell honey at a higher price. Danny sat down beside her. He didn't say everything would be all right. He didn't try to comfort her. He said he would breed bees for her that would pollinate only medicinal plants, a specialized strain. He had already begun the breeding process. In 2 generations they would be ready, and that the first jar of healing honey would be labeled with her name, for her patients, not for sale. Evelyn took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes, put them back on, nodded. On the 10th day of preparation, a letter arrived, one of 12, from Baron Ricard of the town of Melchior, a former buyer of the Ashford's honey, an old soldier. He wrote briefly, "I'm coming, with 20 men. I'll be there in 4 days. Have your beekeeper prepare a spoonful of honey for me. I haven't tasted it in 10 years." Margaret read the letter. Her hands, clad in her grandmother's gloves, trembled. She knew Baron Ricard. He used to visit them every fall. He'd buy a barrel of honey. He'd play chess with her when she was little, sometimes let her win on purpose. She folded the letter, hid it in her pocket, went to work. On the 13th day, the scout bumblebees detected movement. South, 3 kilometers. A large group, 40 to 50 people, on horseback and on foot, moving toward the monastery, marching speed. The order. Danny stood on the roof and looked south. Standing next to him was G. A stood nearby with a bow, Evelyn with a bag of medicines, Margaret with a logbook pressed to her chest, So Yun in a dark cloak, her face calm. Lillian came out of the chapel. She stood beside him, silently. For the first time she was standing next to him, not in the doorway. Danny looked at her. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, and that was enough. Danny turned toward the hives on the roof. 3 hives of combat manna bees. 240 individuals. He placed his palm on the lid of the nearest one. The wood was warm from the life inside. The bees were humming. Low, steady, ready. Danny had prepared for the Order's attack over the past 2 weeks. He had bred the combat bees with sleep-inducing venom. He scattered the hives among hiding places in the forest. Margaret summoned allies, and Baron Ricard is coming with 20 men. So Yun exposed the spies and helped with disinformation. The Order marched out with a force of 40 to 50 men. They arrived at dawn. Danny hadn't slept. He sat on the roof with his eyes closed, listening to the patrol bumblebees. They had detected movement during the night. The column was moving along the southern road, slowly, in an organized manner, with torches. They weren't hiding. They weren't lurking. They were marching openly, like an army that isn't afraid of being seen. 47 people. Mercenaries in leather armor with short swords at their belts. A dozen alchemists in gray robes with heavy bags on their shoulders. And at the front, on a white horse, one man, Cedric Mall, the supreme keeper of wax. Danny climbed down from the roof an hour before dawn. He He walked around the hives, every single one, 30 of them. He ran his hand over the lids. The wood was warm. Inside there was a humming, quiet, steady. The bees sensed his anxiety and responded to it in the only way they knew how, with their presence. We are here. We are working. We are alive. He walked into the refectory. Everyone was already there. Jia was checking the arrows, 30 in the quiver, each with a tip sharpened to a razor's edge. Her face was impassive, her eyes focused. She was in her element. Not the monastery, not the apiary. Battle. That was what she was born and trained for. Evelyn sat at the table. Before her lay pouches of herbs, bandages made from linen sheets, clay jars of tinctures, her first aid kit in case of injuries. Her hands were calm, methodical. She was sorting through her tools like a pianist before a concert. Margaret stood by the window, upright, wearing her grandmother's gloves, chin lifted. She didn't know how to fight. She didn't know how to shoot. She didn't know how to treat wounds. But she stood there, because this was her home, her first real home in 3 years. So Yun sat in the corner, a dark cloak, hood pulled down, eyes closed. She was breathing evenly and deeply, getting ready. For what exactly, Danny didn't know, but he could see that her hands lay on her knees, palms up, fingers slightly bent. She knew the Order's alchemy. Every reagent, every spell, every weakness. Tome and Renard stood by the door with swords in their hands. Not warriors, novices, but stubborn ones. Gilbert and Martin were on the walls, watching. A former mercenary carpenter named Gregor stood at the gate with an axe. He had awakened from a dream of flowering meadows 2 weeks ago, and stayed. Said the axe was for wood, but, if necessary, he would remember what else it was for. Lillian stepped out of the chapel. In her hands she held a tray, 12 mugs of hot herbal tea. She silently handed one to each person. She approached Danny last. She held out a mug. Their fingers touched on the clay, for a second. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't pull his away either. Then she stepped back and stood by the door, in her place. Danny drank the brew. Bitter, invigorating, with a hint of mint and something else. Something that Lillian added just for him. He never asked what it was. He went out into the courtyard. Dawn was breaking. The sky was turning gray in the east, and to the south, half a kilometer from the gate, torches appeared. They moved in a straight line, mercenaries in front, alchemists behind them, and in the center, a white horse. Cedric Mall, 60 years old, straight as a spear in the saddle, a silver cloak, gray hair combed back. He halted the column 100 meters from the gate, dismounted, handed over the reins, adjusted his cloak, and walked toward the monastery. Alone, without guards, slowly, confidently, elegantly, like a man who had come to take what was rightfully his by virtue of his strength. Danny stepped out of the gate, alone, in a wax-splattered apron, with wood shavings in his hair. Barefoot. He had forgotten to put on his shoes, or chosen not to. Cedric stopped 10 paces away. He looked at Danny, from top to bottom. Not because he was taller, because he was used to looking at everyone that way. With curiosity. With a touch of contempt. Like a scientist examining an interesting, but not particularly important specimen. He spoke. His voice was soft, velvety, the voice of a man who gives orders in a whisper and is still heard. He said he was impressed. He wasn't being insincere. That in 2 months, Danny had done what the Order hadn't been able to do in 10 years. That he'd brought back the bees, brought back the honey, brought back hope. That this was genuine talent, and that such talent deserves better than a backwater monastery with a leaky roof. That the Order is offering one last time, a partnership, a real one, an honest one. Danny would become the Order's chief beekeeper. The best workshops, the best alchemists, unlimited resources, protection, honor, a title, land, everything he wants. In exchange, one small thing, all the honey through the Order. All the varieties are the Order's property. All knowledge is passed on to the Order. All future apiaries under the Order's control. Danny listened. The wind ruffled his shirt. His bare feet stood on the cold stone. He waited for Cedric to finish. Then he asked one thing. Did Cedric know what had happened 12 years ago? Cedric's face didn't flinch, not a single muscle. Professional composure. 60 years of practice. He replied that history is history. The past cannot be brought back. What matters is the future. Order, control, stability. Without order, honey will become a cause of war. Without control, the bees will run wild again. Without stability, Arian will collapse. A strong hand is needed. One hand. The hand of the Order. Danny shook his head. He said that Cedric had killed the world for profit, that he had summoned a man from another world and set him upon the bees, that the plague he had ordered had destroyed not only the wild pollinators, but everyone, every single person, that for 10 years the children had been eating bark and root vegetables, that 117 people had died in Redmore alone because the medicinal herbs had lost their potency, that Margaret's father had taken his own life because he could not pass on live bees to his daughter, that the Jia clan had perished from starvation, that Lillian had taken a vow on the day of the catastrophe, believing it to be God's punishment, that thousands of people across Arian were starving and dying and losing hope because of a single decision made by a single man. Those stands before him in a silver robe and speaks of order. The answer is no. It was no. It will always be no, as long as Danny breathes. Cedric listened. His face remained unchanged. When Danny finished, he nodded, briefly, as if he'd crossed an item off a list. He turned around. He walked toward his men. He raised his right hand. The mercenaries moved forward, in a straight line, swords drawn from their sheaths. The alchemists began pulling flasks from their bags. Danny raised his hand too, but not as a signal to fight. He opened 3 hives on the roof, simultaneously, with a mental command through the panel. 240 combat mana bees took to the air. The sound was such that the mercenaries stopped, not on command, instinctively. A buzzing, low, dense, vibrating. It came from above and from all sides at once. A black and gold cloud spread out over the monastery like a living shield. 240 bees, each the size of a thumb joint, each with a specially bred venom, each controlled through the hive mind. The mercenaries looked up. Many of them had never seen a bee in their lives. For those born after the Silent Spring or too young to remember, this was their first encounter. For those who remembered, it was a sound from childhood, from a past life, from a world they had buried. One mercenary lowered his sword. another, a third. Not out of fear, out of confusion. The swarm struck. Danny directed the first wave. 60 bees, a low pass over the front line of mercenaries, precise stings, to the neck, to the arms, to any exposed patch of skin. 20 men received 1 sting each. That was enough. The venom took effect in 30 seconds. The first mercenary froze mid-step. His eyes widened, then his eyelids drooped. He swayed, forward, backward, and fell onto the grass. Gently, like a child being put to sleep. A smile slowly spread across his face. The dream had already begun. Blooming meadows, a warm breeze, the scent of honey. The second mercenary fell 3 seconds after the first, the third, the fourth. They fell one after another, like dominoes. No screams, no pain. They simply fell asleep. The second wave, another 60 bees, the flanks. The mercenaries who had tried to bypass the monastery. 15 stings, 50 asleep. One managed to swing his sword. The swing stopped in midair. The sword slipped from his limp fingers. The mercenary sank to his knees. He smiled. He lay on his side. He fell asleep. The alchemists reacted faster. 2 threw smoke bombs. A wall of acrid gray smoke rose. The smoke was meant to disorient the bees, to disrupt the pheromone trails, a classic method from the old textbooks. A method that didn't work against mana bees controlled via a magical system. Danny simply switched control from pheromones to visual cues. The bees could see through the smoke. The patrol bumblebees approached from the upwind side and marked the targets. Jia fired from the roof. 3 arrows. Not a single one hit a person. All 3 struck the alchemist's bags. Skin tore, vials shattered, reagents spilled onto the ground, powders mixed with the dirt. Useless. One alchemist tried to ignite a fire charge. So-yun stepped out from behind the wall and uttered 3 words. Counterspell. The charge went out. The alchemist stared at his hands with the expression of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. So-yun knew every ritual of the order, every formula, every weak spot. 10 years of service, turned into a weapon. 4 minutes later, it was all over. 41 out of 47 lay sleeping on the grass in front of the monastery, some on their backs, some on their sides, some curled up in a ball. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was seeing the same dream, the world as it was before the silent spring. Beautiful, blooming, buzzing. 6 remained. Cedric's personal guard, hardened fighters in full armor, closed helmets with visors, leather gloves, not a single patch of exposed skin. They were preparing. They knew about the bees. Cedric had prepared them specifically. Danny called the swarm back. 240 bees returned to the hives. They settled down. They fell silent. Silence. Cedric stood among the sleeping mercenaries. Around him, the 6 in armor. His face didn't change. He slowly pulled a glass vial from his belt. Small, about the size of a finger. Red liquid inside. Thick. Dark. Like blood. He raised it above his head. He spoke. His voice was steady. No threat. Just a statement of fact. He said it was a concentrate of the magical plague. That very one. His last supply. Kept in his personal safe for 12 years. For a worst-case scenario. If he broke the vial, every pollinator within a kilometer would die in a minute. Every bee. Every bumblebee. Every moth. Every beetle. Everything Danny had raised. all breeds, all lines, all generations. Silent spring would return, local but absolute. The world in the monastery courtyard froze. Jia froze on the roof with her bow drawn, aiming at Cedric's arm. The arrow will hit. She never misses. But if the arrow knocks the vial out of his hand, it will shatter. Red liquid will spurt into the air. The plague will break loose. If she doesn't shoot, Cedric might smash the vial himself. If she shoots him in the head, he might reflexively let go of the vial. It will fall. It will shatter. A dead end. Danny stared at the red vial. Small, no bigger than a finger. Inside, the death of everything he had built. His grandfather's 200 beehives in Oregon, a swarm on the wires, an electric shock, darkness, and awakening. A queen bee under the fountain, bumblebees in an oak hollow, moths in the ruins, beetles on the cross's fountain, a mountain bee in a crack in the rock. Every step, every sleepless night, every frame hand-planed, honey on a little girl's lips, children's laughter, an old man's tears, buds on apple trees. Everything, in a single glass vial. Danny took a step forward. Cedric raised an eyebrow. Danny took another step. The guards raised their swords. Cedric gestured for them to stop. He was curious. What would the young beekeeper do? Danny walked, slowly, unarmed, without magic, barefoot through the morning dew, his apron stained with wax, sawdust in his hair. A beekeeper. Just a beekeeper. He approached Cedric to within arm's reach, stopped, looked him in the eyes, cold, gray, intelligent. The eyes of a man who, for 60 years, had calculated every move 3 steps ahead. Danny spoke, quietly, without malice, without fear. He said that the plague in the vial would kill the bees here, in the monastery, in the garden, maybe for a kilometer around, but it won't kill the bees in the hiding places, at 3 locations deep in the Black Forest, where Jia had moved 10 hives with queens from 2 genetic lines. It won't kill the bumblebees that have already spread out through the forest on their own. It won't kill the moths near the moon jasmine 2 kilometers from here. It won't kill the beetles living on the Cross estate 7 kilometers to the east. Because Danny isn't an idiot. He's a beekeeper. And the first rule of beekeeping his grandfather taught him in Oregon: never keep all the queens in one hive. Cedric listened. His hand holding the vial didn't move, but his fingers had turned white. He was gripping the glass too tightly. Danny continued. He said that even if Cedric smashed the vial and destroyed everything here, in a week Danny would come to the reserve hives. In 2 weeks, he'd restore the apiary. In a month, there would be 30 hives. In 3 months, 60. Because knowledge cannot be destroyed by a plague. Skill cannot be poisoned. The design of the Langstroth hive cannot be erased from memory. The 8-millimeter space of the hive cannot be forgotten. Controlled mating cannot be undone. Everything is needed for revival, fits into a single mind. His mind. And as long as he lives, the bees will return. Again, and again, and again. Cedric was silent. Danny had said the last word, that the people around him cannot be bribed, because each of them received from Danny not money, not titles, not promises. Each received a hive, a personal one, made for them, healing bees for Evelyn, glowing bumblebees for Jia, records for restoring the golden bees for Margaret, An open apiary program for So Yun. You can't buy that. You can't steal it. You can't destroy it. You can only give it away. And he gave it away. Cedric stood motionless. His hand was slowly lowering, centimeter by centimeter. Behind him, dust rose on the southern road, the pounding of hooves. 21 horsemen burst from behind the hill. At the front, a heavy-set man on a red horse, a graying beard, chainmail beneath a traveling cloak, an axe on the saddle. Baron Ricard of Melchior. He was 30 minutes late, but he made it in time. The horsemen formed a semicircle behind the sleeping mercenaries. Ricard did not dismount. He looked down at Cedric with the expression of an old soldier who had seen too many scoundrels to be surprised by yet another. Cedric turned around. He saw the horsemen. He saw the sleeping mercenaries on the grass, their faces smiling, their arms outstretched, like children after a long day. He saw Danny in front of him, barefoot, unarmed, fearless. He looked up at the sky. Bees were circling above the monastery, returning from their hives, not on command, of their own accord, golden dots against the backdrop of the pink dawn sky. Bumblebees buzzed above the walls. 2 moths that hadn't managed to fly away before dawn sat on the roof, shimmering silver in the first rays. Rainbow beetles crawled over the stones of the walls, alive, buzzing, invincible. Cedric lowered his hand. He set the vial on the ground. Carefully. Slowly. The glass touched the stone without a sound. He straightened up. He looked at Danny. For the first time, there was no coldness in his eyes, no calculation. There was weariness. Deep. 12 years' worth. The weariness of a man who carried a secret too heavy for one person to bear. He said quietly that he had lost. Not to a boy, to life. He turned, walked to the horse, sat down. His 6 guards stood around him. He looked at the monastery one last time, at the beehives, at the bees in the air, at the barefoot boy in an apron, and rode away, silently, without looking back. The mercenaries woke up 4 hours later, one by one. They sat down on the grass, rubbed their eyes, their faces wet with tears. Each had seen the same dream. Meadows, flowers, buzzing, honey. The world as it was, the world as it could be again. One man, strong, with an axe at his belt, a carpenter by trade, a mercenary by necessity. He walked up to Danny, looked up at him because he was sitting on the grass, asked hoarsely, "What kind of dream was that?" Why was he crying in his sleep? He hadn't cried in 12 years. And here he was, crying in his sleep. Danny sat down beside him. He said it was the bees. They showed him what had been and what would be. The man was silent. Then he asked if he could stay. Danny asked what he could do. The man said he was a carpenter. Danny said he needed 20 new beehives by the end of the week. The man stood up. He dusted himself off. He nodded. He walked toward the workshop. 7 more mercenaries remained by evening. The rest left. Not to the order, they just left. With teary eyes and smiles they couldn't wipe off their faces. Danny stood at the gate and watched them leave. Evelyn approached, stood beside him, said quietly that the venom of these bees was the most humane weapon she'd ever seen in her life. Danny replied that it wasn't a weapon, it was an invitation. Evelyn looked at him. She took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, nodded. For the first time in the 2 months they'd known each other, she smiled at him. Not professionally, not politely, genuinely, warmly. Danny picked up the vial of plague, carefully, with 2 fingers. He took it to So-Yun. He said it needed to be destroyed safely. So-Yun took the vial. She looked at the red liquid inside. She said she knew how. Alchemical neutralization. It would take a day and the right reagents. She would do it. Danny thanked her. He went into the garden. He sat down next to the beehives. He placed his palms on the lids. Warm wood. A buzzing sound. Life. He sat there until dark. A year had passed. 365 days since that morning when Danny Hahn opened his eyes in the stone cell and didn't hear a single bee. He stood on the hill above the monastery of St. Apollon and looked down. He didn't recognize the place. The monastery's stone walls stood where they had always stood, old, sturdy. But a whole village had sprung up around them. New buildings made of light-colored wood. A workshop where Gregor and his 3 apprentices built beehives. A storeroom with rows of clay pots sealed with wax. A classroom where 20 students sat on benches and drew frame designs. 2 residential buildings. A bathhouse. A bakery that ran on apple wood. And a kitchen from which the scent of fresh bread with honey wafted. 30 beehives in the monastery garden, each one numbered. Each one in Margaret's journal. Another 20 beyond the wall on the southern slope. Another 10 by the apple orchard. 3 satellite apiaries. 1 in the village near Redmore, 1 in Melchior at Baron Rickard's, 1 in the former temple of the order, converted by So-Yun into an open apiary. The apple orchard. Danny turned his head and looked at it. 40 trees were bending under the weight of the fruit. The branches were tied with ropes to stakes so they wouldn't break under the weight. Apples hung in clusters. Red, yellow, green with a blush on the sunny side. Gnarled, ugly. All different sizes. Wild trees, with no agronomy to speak of, were giving what they could. But they were giving, for the first time in a decade. Bees buzzed beneath the trees. 6th-generation hybrid man-bees. Large, strong, with a golden sheen on their backs. Bumblebees flitted above Evelyn's flower beds. Rainbow beetles crawled through the garden beds. At night, silvery moths danced over the field of moon jasmine that stretched from the temple ruins to the very horizon. White flowers, silver wings. Silence and light. 12 breeds of manna bees, among them 3 specialized ones. Evelyn's healing bees, which pollinated only medicinal plants. Their honey acted as an antiseptic and anti-inflammatory. Mountain hybrids that flew in the cold and at high altitudes, expanding the pollination range into the foothills. And Danny's latest pride and joy, the Ashford golds. He found them, after 3 months of searching. A single queen, in an abandoned basement of the former Ashford estate, 12 kilometers to the south. Alive. Barely. Locked in a walled-up room among dried-out combs and dead workers. She had survived 10 years in that sealed space, feeding on the remnants of honey. A miracle. Or the stubbornness that Dan had long since ceased to distinguish from a miracle. He restored her. Crossbred her with records from Margaret's archive. Bred the 1st generation. The 2nd, the 3rd. The Ashford golds were back, with long proboscis, with increased honey production, with disease resistance, a breed that 4 generations of the Ashford family had created and perfected. Alive, flying, producing honey. When Danny brought Margaret the hive with the first colony of Ashford golds, she stood and looked at him. For a long time. Her face didn't move, her lips didn't tremble, her eyes didn't shine. She just stood there. Then she sat down on a bench. She took off her grandmother's gloves. She placed them on her lap. She looked at her hands, weathered, calloused from work, with wax stains. Not the hands of an aristocrat, the hands of a beekeeper. She put the gloves back on. She stood up. She walked over to the hive. She opened the lid. She pulled out a frame. Golden bees crawled across the combs, large, bright, with their characteristic elongated proboscis. Margaret held the frame, and for the first time in all the time Danny had known her, she was at a loss for words. 4 species of bumblebees. Among them were the glowing ones, the very ones Danny had promised to Jia. He had kept his promise in the 4th month. Bumblebees with bioluminescent abdomens, a soft, bluish-white light, enough to see the path in the dark. They bonded with their owner through a pheromone mark. They flew around, they landed on his shoulders. They buzzed quietly, like little motors. Jia received 3. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just took them. She went into the forest. She returned a day later. She walked silently into Danny's workshop. She placed a fresh deer hide on the table, perfectly skinned, soft, for lining the new beehives for winter. She looked at him. He looked at her. She left. That was Jia's way of saying thank you. From then on, she went into the forest with 3 glowing bumblebees on her shoulders, and she came back faster, and she smiled. Rarely, but she smiled. For the first time in 5 years since the clan's demise, honey flowed like a river. The warehouse was full. Apple honey. Thick, golden, slightly tart. Lavender honey. Dark, fragrant, healing honey from Evelyn's bees. Moon jasmine honey. Silvery, glowing in the dark. It was sold in 4 cities through a network Margaret had built from her father's former partners and new allies. A fair price, not a monopoly, not exorbitant. Affordable for ordinary people. The money went toward expansion, toward new apiaries, toward a beekeeping school, toward helping the villages, toward the seeds Evelyn distributed to farmers. The order of silver wax was falling apart. After Cedric's retreat, the junior guardians began to leave. Some quietly, others by slamming the door. Some came to the monastery. They begged to be admitted. So-Yun met with each one. She talked for hours. She tested them. She weeded out those who came seeking new power. She kept those who came seeking redemption. She understood the difference. She turned the order's former temples into open apiaries, one after another. Honey for the poor. Rituals turned inside out. Instead of closed ceremonies for the chosen few, open lessons for everyone. Instead of secret recipes locked away behind 7 seals, publicly accessible knowledge recorded by Margaret and reproduced by scribes. So-Yun worked 20 hours a day, fiercely, merciless toward herself, not for forgiveness. She didn't believe in forgiveness. For the future. Danny saw it. One evening, when So-Yun was poring over a map of new apiaries by the light of a single candle, he walked in. He set a jar of honey on the table, silvery, moonlit. He said she was doing more than he could have asked. So-Yun looked at the jar, then at him. She replied that 10 years of silence require 10 years of shouting. She had only just begun. Danny nodded. He left. He understood that hunger, the hunger of a man who wants to patch up a hole he himself helped tear open. The royal court had sent a delegation 3 months ago. 5 courtiers in silk robes, charters, seals, official recognition, a title. Danny was granted the title of Royal Keeper of Pollinators. He hadn't asked for it. He didn't want it. But Margaret said the title provided legal protection for the apiaries and tax breaks. And land rights. Danny agreed. He hung the title on the workshop wall next to the hive blueprints. Dust settled in an even layer on the parchment. A young woman had come with the delegation. Young, 19 years old, in a simple traveling dress. No jewelry, no crown, no entourage. Princess Adeline Valrin, the third daughter of King Arion. Not an heir, not a politician, not a warrior. She asked her father to send her to the beekeeper. Her father agreed, more out of weariness from arguing with his youngest daughter than out of conviction. Adeline came to see Danny on the first day. Her eyes were huge, serious, sincere. She asked how she could help. She didn't say, "How can I serve?" She didn't say, "At your command." She said, "Help." Danny gave her a frame, full of honey, heavy, 3 kilograms. Adeline took it. Her hands trembled under the weight. She almost dropped it. She held on. She looked at him. He said he would teach her from scratch, like everyone else. No special treatment for royal blood. That royal blood meant nothing to a bee, only steady hands. Adeline nodded. 3 months later, she was working in the apiary on equal footing with the apprentices, her hands covered in wax and propolis, her hair tucked under a scarf, her dress stained. She didn't notice, or didn't think it mattered. She turned out to be a good student, patient, attentive, with gentle hands that didn't scare the bees, and with a gift for listening that Danny rarely encountered. She listened to the bees, not through skill, not through a monitor. She simply stood next to the hive and listened, and the bees behaved more calmly around her than usual. Danny didn't understand why, but he noticed. The Honey Festival. Danny organized it on the anniversary of his arrival, the first one, he hoped not the last. In the monastery courtyard, tables made of fresh planks, pots of honey, every variety, free for everyone. The lines stretched from the gate to the road and along the road to the turn. Hundreds of people, refugees, farmers, merchants, artisans, old people, children, families, lonely people, all kinds, alive. Danny stood at the table and handed out honey, spoonful by spoonful, face by face. An old man, hunchbacked, with dull eyes, he approached, took a spoon, brought it to his mouth, tasted it, closed his eyes, stood there for a minute, maybe 2. Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks. Quietly, without sobs, they just flowed, like water through a crack in a rock. He opened his eyes, looked at Danny, said he thought he'd forgotten that taste, that he thought it no longer existed in the world, that he'd lived 10 years without that taste, and every day the world had grown grayer and quieter and more meaningless. And now the taste had returned, and the world had returned. The line was silent. No one was rushing him. No one was moving. Everyone stood and listened to the old man. Danny silently scooped up another spoonful for him. He held it out. The old man took it. He looked at the spoon, at the honey, at Danny. He said thank you. Not to him, to the bees. Danny nodded. That was the right person to thank. That evening after the festival, Danny climbed up to the roof, to his spot. He sat down. He dangled his legs. The night air smelled of apples and honey and flowers. Arion's air was changing. Slowly, but it was changing. A year ago it had smelled only of stone and dry grass. The panel hung before his eyes. The hive keeper, Level 10. The first phase of ecosystem restoration is complete. Arion's ecosystem has been restored by 11%. He reread the number. 11. If the pace continues, full restoration will take about 8 years, maybe 9. He might not live to see it. He might. It doesn't matter. Something else matters. The process is underway. The students have been trained. 20 people know how to build hives and work with bees. The breeds have been developed. 12 lines, recorded, documented, passed on. Margaret makes sure that no knowledge is lost. 3 satellite apiaries are operational. Soon there will be 6, then 12, then 100. The bees are flying. The world no longer depends on a single person. The panel flashed. A new notification. He read it. He read it again. Slowly. Return. Available. The hivekeeper can be deactivated voluntarily. The host will be returned to their world of origin. Body restored, injuries healed. Condition: complete and irrevocable renunciation of the skill. The hivekeeper skill will be lost forever. The sense of the hive, the cradle, selection, the language of the hive, controlled mating. Everything will disappear. The host will become an ordinary person. The decision is irreversible. He read and reread. The letters swam before his eyes. Home, Oregon, grandfather's apiary, 200 hives on the hillside, a little honey shop by the road, the scent of an American autumn, rain on the roof, familiar constellations, the language everyone around speaks without magical translation. Mom's kitchen, Grandpa's chair on the porch. Price, skill, everything with which he had revived this world. He would become an ordinary beekeeper, with ordinary knowledge, which, however, was also considerable. He sat on the roof and thought. The wind ruffled his shirt. Strange stars shone overhead. A year. In a year, he hadn't learned a single constellation. Down in the courtyard, lights were burning. Warm, alive. Oil lamps and candles. Voices could be heard. Laughter. Music. One of the students was playing a homemade flute. Out of tune, but earnestly. Children were running around the courtyard. 12. No, 17 already. 5 new ones in the last few months, picked up on the roads and in ravaged villages. All well-fed, healthy, loud. The youngest girl, the one who first tried the honey a year ago, had grown 3 centimeters and learned to read. Lillian taught her in the evenings. Evelyn sat on a bench against the wall, a notebook on her lap, a quill in her hand. She was writing down her observations on a new variety of healing honey by the light of an oil lamp. Next to a pot stood on the floor. There was an inscription on the pot, "For Evelyn's patients, not for sale." Danny had signed it 2 months ago. Evelyn had placed it on her desk and hadn't moved it. Margaret sat at the table in the workshop. A book lay before her, a thick one, bound in leather, the pedigree book of Arion's new bees. Begun on blank pages, a continuation of the records left by her father, and his father, and his father before him. 4 generations of Ashfords, and the 5th, hers. She wrote in her grandmother's gloves, which were no longer a symbol of loss. They had become work gloves. Soyun spoke with Baron Rickard at the gate, about deliveries, about routes, about the next open apiary, about how to explain to the order's former parishioners that honey should not be a luxury, that it should be like water, accessible to everyone. Adeline was washing the honey pots by the well, sleeves rolled up, hands in soapy water, dress stained. The crown of the king's third daughter lay in a chest in the capital. Here she was a student, a beekeeper, a person with gentle hands and a calm heart. Zhi sat on the wall, as always, just like on the first day, but not alone. A glowing bumblebee sat on her right shoulder, a second one on her left, a third circled above her head. A bluish-white light fell on her face, soft, warm. She looked out at the courtyard, at the people, at the lights, and on her face was an expression Danny had never seen before. Peace. Not happiness. Peace. The peace of a person who had found a flock after 5 years of solitude. Lillian stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked out at the courtyard, at the people, at the children, at the beekeeper on the roof who thought he couldn't be seen from above. She could see him. She always could. In her hand was a sprig of apple tree with small green fruits. Not the one he'd left by the door. Another one. From a sapling. The very one that had grown from the twig she'd planted by the wall of her cell. The little tree had taken root. It had put down roots. It had produced its first shoots. Tiny, stubborn, alive, like everything in this monastery. Danny watched them from above, at each one. Evelyn with her notebook, Jia with the bumblebees, Margaret in gloves, So-Yun with the maps, Adeline by the well, Lillian in the doorway, Benedict in the chapel. He hadn't come out for the celebration. He was praying. For the bees, for the people, for Danny, in his own way, quietly, as best he could. Tom and Renard and Gregor and the students and the children and everyone else. His people. His hive. Danny closed his eyes, opened them. The stars were still there, strangers. A year ago, he didn't know a single constellation. He still didn't know them now. Not because he hadn't tried, because he didn't need the stars to feel at home. He opened the panel, found the notification. Return, available. Read it again, one last time. Pressed. Decline. The panel flashed. Confirm refusal to return. Decision irreversible. The carrier will remain in the current world forever. He confirmed, without hesitation, without pause, without a sigh. The panel went dark for a second. It lit up again. Guardian of the Hive, Level 10. Status, permanent. The host accepted the world. The world accepted the host. New objective. Complete restoration of Aerion's ecosystem. Estimated time, 8 years. He closed the panel, leaned against the warm wooden beam. The very same one. The one he had leaned on a year ago when he sat here for the first time. Dirty, lost, with a single half-dead queen in the cradle. The beam smelled of wax, honey, dry wood, like the roof of a beehive house in Oregon. He spoke softly, in Korean, 4 words he had saved all year. Grandpa, you'd be proud. He paused, added more. I've raised a swarm. I've raised a whole world. He paused. The wind blew from the west. It carried the scent of moon jasmine and apples and honey. He added the last part. And I'm staying. My bees are here. My people are here. My hive is here. Down below, Lillian raised her head. She looked at the roof. She couldn't hear. The distance, the darkness, the wind. But she looked, right where he was sitting. And she smiled, quietly, with just her lips. just like on that first day when 4 bumblebees took flight and the monastery heard a buzzing sound for the first time in 10 years. Danny smiled back. She didn't see it. Or maybe she did. It didn't matter. Somewhere far to the north, beyond the Black Forest, beyond the mountains, beyond the wastelands in an abandoned tower, a man named Marcus opened his eyes. He stood by the window. He looked south, toward the monastery beyond the horizon, toward the apiary, toward the buzzing. He could feel it. The keeper of silence could feel the return of sound. A year ago, the south was silent. 6 months ago, it began to whisper. Now it was humming. Quietly, far away, but it hummed. Marcus stood by the window and listened, and on his face was an expression that hadn't appeared in 12 years. Not joy, not fear, not guilt. Relief. Someone had come. Someone was fixing what he had broken. Someone was bringing sound back to the world he had made silent. Marcus closed his eyes. He opened them. He turned away from the window. A map lay on the table in front of him. The route south. 3 weeks. He didn't know what he would say when he got there. Didn't know if they would accept him, if they would forgive him, if they would let him help. But he knew one thing. The silence was over. It was time to go. In the morning, Danny would get up, just like every morning, before dawn. He'll check the hives, feed the queens, harvest the honey, teach his students, take notes, drink his tea from a clay mug by the door, leave a twig with a flower at Lillian's door, look at the map, choose the direction of his next expedition, maybe the mountains, maybe the coast, maybe a new species, maybe an old enemy turned friend. The world was vast, 89% dead, but 11% alive. And every day, every hour, every flight of every bee, that percentage grew, quietly, slowly, unstoppably, like honey dripping down a spoon, drop by drop, flower by flower, hive by hive. Danny Kahn closed his eyes. Bees buzzed above the monastery of St. Apollo. Bumblebees flew over the fields. Silvery moths danced above the moon jasmine. Rainbow beetles crawled through the garden beds. Children laughed in the courtyard. A flute played out of tune and beautifully. Arion breathed, quietly, hoarsely.